Welcome back to Outlaw Operations. Tonight, we're diving into a chilling case filled with deception, greed, and betrayal. A story that seemed to be about love and ambition but ended in tragedy. Before we get into it, take a second to drop a comment. Where are you listening from? And if you enjoy true crime storytelling, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's settle in and get started. It was December 2008, and the Ortega family, filled with excitement, prepared for one of their favorite traditions, Christmas at their warm, beautiful home in Covina, California. Covina was the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked, where crime seemed like something that only happened somewhere else. Just 30 kilometers outside of Los Angeles, it was a quiet place where Joseph and Alice Ortega had raised their 5 children, Charles, James, Alicia, Leticia, and Sylvia. Christmas had always been sacred for Joseph and Alice, a time when the entire family gathered under one roof to laugh, reminisce, and celebrate life. That year, just like all the years before, the house buzzed with energy. They played poker, a family tradition, teasing each other over lucky hands and bad bluffs, their laughter echoing through the house as twinkling lights cast a soft glow. Then, somewhere in the middle of that joyful noise, the doorbell rang. No one hesitated. Why would they? It was Christmas Eve. They expected nothing but friends or maybe a late visitor dropping off gifts. Someone opened the door, not knowing that death stood on the other side, dressed in a Santa Claus suit. Moments later, chaos erupted. A neighbor, trembling with panic, called 911. His voice shook as he screamed that the house across the street was engulfed in flames. He begged dispatchers to send firefighters immediately. Sirens wailed into the night as emergency units sped toward the burning home. On their way, dispatch received a flood of frantic calls. Gunshots had been heard, people were seen running from the house, crying, bleeding, desperate for help. When police and fire crews arrived, they were met with a vision straight from hell. Flames tore through the Ortega home, consuming everything in their path. Emergency personnel sprinted in every direction, trying to fight the inferno and search for survivors. Neighbors huddled together in the street, watching helplessly, some sobbing as they witnessed the horror unfold before their eyes. Through the smoke and terror, rescuers found 2 survivors, Leticia Ortega and her 8-year-old daughter, Katrina. Both had managed to escape the nightmare. At first, it seemed they had simply fled the fire. But the truth, once uncovered, was even more chilling. Katrina had been shot, seriously wounded, and rushed to the hospital where doctors fought to save her fragile life. Leticia, though injured and traumatized, was able to speak. From her hospital bed, she told detectives a story that stunned the entire city. A man, dressed as Santa Claus, had walked into their Christmas celebration, and started shooting. After the bloodshed, he set the house ablaze, trying to destroy any evidence of what he had done. Leticia, struggling with her injuries, couldn't give many more details. But what she said was enough to turn a happy holiday into a nightmare that would haunt Covina forever. Neighbors later backed up her story, claiming they had seen a suspicious car, marked with a Santa Claus decoration, speeding away from the cul-de-sac shortly after 2:45 a.m. Police wasted no time, launching a massive investigation as the ruins of the Ortega home still smolder. When the flames were finally extinguished, what remained was devastating. 9 bodies were found inside the charred home. The heat had been so intense that several victims could only be identified through dental records. Forensic teams later revealed that Joseph, Alice, and their daughter Sylvia had died from gunshot wounds. The others suffered gunshot injuries but ultimately died from smoke inhalation or burns as the fire consumed the house. And just when it seemed the horror couldn't deepen, another grim discovery was made. In nearby Sylmar, California, Bruce Pardo, 40 years old, was found dead by his brother. Bruce had a single gunshot wound to the head. A 9mm pistol rested on his knees, another lay close by on the floor. At first, police thought it was a suicide. A tragic ending for a man spending Christmas alone. But the details didn't sit right. Bruce Pardo had finalized a bitter divorce from Sylvia Ortega just days before the massacre, on December 18, 2008. Sylvia's maiden name was Ortega, and she had been among those brutally killed at the family gathering. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Investigators found bloody footprints around Bruce's car. Witnesses confirmed seeing that same car, marked with Santa imagery, fleeing the Ortega home just as the fire erupted. And despite the disguise, Letitia had recognized the attacker. She told police, through broken sobs, that the man under the Santa mask looked a lot like Bruce Pardo. Other surviving family members had screamed his name during the attack. Police now saw the chilling picture clearly. Bruce had harbored a festering hatred towards Sylvia and her family, resentment that only grew during the painful divorce. What should have been a celebration of family turned into a calculated, merciless slaughter. Bruce had used the holiday gathering, an event he knew would bring them all together, as an opportunity to carry out a twisted plan of vengeance. He showed no mercy. Not even to the children. Inside Bruce's abandoned rental car, police found even more disturbing items, remnants of the Santa suit, high-powered firearms, and homemade incendiary devices. It was clear he had planned for even greater destruction. What began as a night of love and laughter ended with sirens screaming through the night, a home reduced to ashes, and an entire community mourning the unthinkable. And the man who orchestrated it all, once a familiar face around the Ortega family's Christmas table, chose to die by his own hand, escaping the justice he so cruelly denied to his victims. The memories of that Christmas Eve would linger like smoke in Covina's streets for years to come. The night when Santa Claus brought death instead of gifts. In the desperate days following Jamie's disappearance, her mother refused to sit still. She became an unstoppable force, posting frequent updates, knocking on the doors of roadside businesses, and questioning strangers like a seasoned investigator. Her determination was so fierce, even the police took notice. It's rare, they said, to see a mother throw herself so deeply into the gritty, exhausting work of a large-scale search. Where many would crumble under the weight of heartbreak, Jamie's mother pressed on, fueled by a raw, unbreakable love. But beneath her relentless energy, there was a pain that words could barely touch, a silent, heavy grief she carried through every interview, every sleepless night. Jamie's father and brother weren't far behind. They too scoured towns, highways, and desert backroads, clinging to hope even as the trail grew colder by the day. As time stretched on, the situation grew more dangerous, especially in the wilderness areas, vast stretches of barren desert where life could so easily slip away unnoticed. If Jamie had ended up there, the odds of finding her alive were heartbreakingly slim. Weeks passed. The desert sun scorched the earth, but no new lead surfaced. Many feared that Jamie had simply disappeared into the vast, unforgiving landscape. But just when hope seemed on the verge of collapsing, a few crucial tips sparked new life into the search. It started with motorists. Travelers who had heard about the missing girl through posters and news reports came forward. They recalled seeing a young woman who matched Jamie's description, a striking figure next to a blue Volkswagen Beetle, stranded by the roadside. Her car hood was up, smoke curling into the hot air. Witnesses said two individuals, darker skinned, had pulled over to help her. A man and a woman. They hadn't seemed suspicious at the time, just kind strangers lending a hand. No one thought to intervene, no one saw any immediate danger. In another life, maybe it would have ended there, a good deed on a lonely highway. But Jamie's beauty, and her bright, unmistakable car, burned into their memories. And when they saw her face on missing posters, doubts began to gnaw at them. Maybe what they'd witnessed wasn't kindness at all. Maybe it was the beginning of something far more sinister. Detectives jumped on the leads immediately, scouring the area where Jamie had last been seen. They zeroed in on the central desert, a barren stretch where, if something terrible had happened, there would be little chance of quick discovery. They placed giant posters along the highway, desperate to catch the eye of anyone who might have seen her or the red car following her that day. But time was their enemy. This was the early 90s, a time before cell phones, GPS tracking, or security cameras. There were no instant alerts, no live location sharing. Communication moved at the speed of landlines and bulletin boards. Tips flooded in, over 200 calls in total. But most were dead ends, wild stories from attention seekers or well-meaning citizens who wanted to help but had little real information. Each false lead chipped away precious hours and hope. Then, nearly a month after Jamie vanished, a new call came in. Different. Urgent. A worker at a remote orchard had found something floating in an irrigation ditch. The police raced to the scene. What they found was devastating. The body of a young woman, badly decomposed by weeks of exposure. Her clothing matched what Jamie's family described: bright pink pants and a light-colored top. Still, investigators held back on immediate identification, waiting for forensic confirmation. Beside the ditch, officers found a shotgun shell, a grim clue suggesting the girl's death had not been an accident. The autopsy revealed a brutal truth: the girl, Jamie Bowie, had been shot twice. The first shot struck her as she raised her hands to protect herself, instinctive, desperate. It tore through her arm and into her face and head. Somehow, she tried to flee, but the killer was merciless. The second shot struck her in the back, ending her life and sending her tumbling into the irrigation channel. The orchard became a crime scene. A silent witness to a brutal act hidden from the world by isolation and indifference. Jamie's body had lain undiscovered for so long because of the remoteness of the location. Few people ventured out there, only the occasional worker, the occasional lost traveler. Wild animals were often the only witnesses in these lonely places. Shockwaves tore through the community when the news broke. Jamie had been beloved, radiant, ambitious, and kind. Her future had shimmered with endless possibilities. Her brother, who shared an unbreakable bond with her, was crushed. Friends and family were left grappling with the unbearable question: who could do something so cruel? And more importantly, why Jamie? Jamie's dream had always been to make it in Hollywood. Her brother, Brian, tearfully told investigators that she had just landed a job at a major film studio, a dream finally within her reach. She had been hired as a PR manager, and for once, everything seemed to be falling into place. But just days after this breakthrough, Jamie's promising future was cruelly ripped away. While the Jamie family was plunged into deep grief, detectives narrowed their focus to a key piece of evidence: a blue Volkswagen Beetle convertible. Witnesses had last seen Jamie with the car, but both she and the vehicle had vanished without a trace. Before her disappearance, she had been spotted struggling with car trouble, helped by two unidentified black individuals. That encounter became the heart of the investigation. Police believed these two strangers might hold the answers to Jamie's fate. Despite relentless efforts, months passed with no progress. Leads dried up. Hopes dimmed. Jamie's case grew colder by the day. But then, nearly 18 months after her tragic death, the investigation took a surprising turn. A tipster alerted police to an abandoned convertible that matched the description, albeit one critical difference: the once bright blue Beetle had been repainted black. The license plates, however, were unmistakable. It was Jamie's car. Detectives combed through every inch of the vehicle, searching for fingerprints, DNA, anything, but the car yielded no immediate clues. Desperate for a breakthrough, authorities held a press conference, appealing to the public for help. They knew that sometimes, all it took was one voice willing to speak up. And this time, someone did. A man called in, claiming he had seen his neighbor driving a car just like the one on the news. Intrigued, investigators tracked him down. During questioning, the neighbor admitted he had, in fact, stolen the car months earlier, but swore he had no part in the murder. In exchange for immunity from theft charges, he offered a critical piece of the puzzle. After stealing the vehicle, he had discovered electrical problems. When he took it to a repair shop, a mechanic's pointed questions about whether the car was stolen made him paranoid. Fearing he would be caught, the thief abandoned the car, repainting it black and dumping it far from his home. More importantly, he gave investigators the name of the repair shop, a place that would soon reveal a dark connection to Jamie's final moments. Detectives quickly paid a visit to the mechanic, who remembered the car, and the couple who had brought it in. A black man and woman, driving a red Volkswagen, had tried to offload the car. The mechanic handed over a sales contract dated just a day after Jamie was reported missing. The contract carried a name, Billy Ray Rakes. At the time of the sale, Billy was 45, living in Los Angeles with his 28-year-old wife, Hilda. When detectives dug into Billy's past, they found a deeply disturbing history. This was a man with violence woven into his very DNA. He had once killed his own brother during a drunken brawl. His rap sheet stretched back to the 1970s, including vandalism, theft, and car-related crimes. It seemed less like coincidence, and more like fate, that he had crossed paths with Jamie. Police wasted no time trying to track down Billy and Hilda. But when they arrived at the couple's home, they found it deserted. The two had fled. Desperate to find them, detectives again turned to the media, branding the couple fugitives. The response was overwhelming. Tip after tip flooded the station. It turned out Billy and Hilda had made more enemies than friends. Eventually, authorities learned Billy had booked a one-way ticket to the Turks and Caicos Islands, but was delayed due to passport issues, meaning he was still hiding somewhere in the city. With a flurry of new leads, police set up an ambush at a parking lot near their home. As Billy and Hilda approached, unaware of the trap, officers swooped in and arrested them. But the hard part was only just beginning. Investigators quickly separated the couple for questioning, a classic move to crack their unity. Hilda, terrified and fraying at the seams, was transported to the police station in a separate car. She was given no information, her mind left to spiral into panic. In the stark, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, her nerves shattered. Faced with mounting fear and isolation, Hilda broke. Between sobs and trembling hands, Hilda painted a chilling picture of what happened to Jamie. According to Hilda, they encountered Jamie by chance on Highway 10. Her car had broken down, engine trouble. Billy had pulled over, offering help. He managed to temporarily restart the vehicle and suggested Jamie follow them to a nearby service station. Grateful and desperate, Jamie agreed. She trusted them. After they reached a small settlement nearby, Jamie, full of gratitude, even invited the couple to join her for dinner at a local restaurant. She had no idea the kindness she extended would cost her life. She had even promised that once she got her first paycheck from her new job, she would repay Billy for all his help. At first, Jamie trusted the couple, completely and without question. She thought she had found friends in Billy and Hilda. She had no idea she had just welcomed her worst nightmare into her life. Billy and Hilda quickly took advantage of her trust. The first step was Billy's plan to steal Jamie's car, something he had done to others before, without a second thought. Hilda, used to Billy's demands and fearful of his temper, didn't resist. She had learned it was safer to agree. But this time, things spiraled far beyond anything Hilda had ever imagined. Billy wasn't just planning a theft. He was planning a murder. At first, Hilda claimed she had no idea about Billy's true intentions. She said she only realized the horrific plan when they were all sitting at a restaurant, Jamie, cheerful and generous, treating the couple to a meal. When Jamie excused herself to use the restroom, Billy leaned across the table, his voice low and cold, and laid out exactly how they were going to hurt her. Still, Jamie remained unaware as she later drove off in her car, with Billy and Hilda following closely behind. They eventually forced her to pull over. That's when the real nightmare began. They kidnapped her, tried to use her bank card at an ATM nearly 100 kilometers away from Los Angeles, and when that didn't work, they even tried their luck at a bank branch in India, only to discover there was no money in her account. Hilda had moments where she wanted to back out, to beg Billy to stop, but fear kept her silent. Fear of Billy, fear of what might happen to her if she said the wrong thing. In their toxic relationship, Billy was the one who called all the shots, and Hilda, trapped and submissive, followed orders without resistance. According to Hilda, Billy ordered Jamie to follow him into the desolate desert. Jamie, perhaps still hoping to survive, obeyed. Moments later, the silence of the desert was shattered by 2 gunshots. Billy returned to the car, alone. Hilda didn't dare ask what had happened. Deep down, she already knew. Jamie was gone. But Billy wasn't finished. Not even close. He kept Jamie's keys and driver's license, which led him straight to her apartment. While Jamie's brother, Brian, was fast asleep inside, Billy broke in, desperate to loot whatever he could find. If Brian had woken up during the burglary, there's no telling if he would have survived. He very likely would have met the same fate as his sister. After stealing valuables, Billy left the apartment. But greed gnawed at him. He returned again later that day, brazenly walking into the apartment in broad daylight to grab more. When police later raided the apartment Billy shared with Hilda, they found some of Jamie's stolen belongings. Other items had already been sold at a pawn shop in Denver for a mere $2,000. Billy and Hilda were desperate for fast cash, so desperate that they even sold Jamie's car at a rock-bottom price. During interrogation, Billy tried to shift the blame onto Hilda. But the evidence told a very different story, a story of cold, calculated cruelty. And Billy's own criminal record painted an even darker picture of the man he truly was. Ultimately, prosecutors offered Hilda a plea deal, testify against Billy in exchange for a reduced sentence. Under state law, Billy faced the death penalty. Hilda agreed to cooperate. Though she hadn't pulled the trigger, her silence and inaction made her complicit in Jamie's death. She pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The trial against Billy began in 1994. It was a difficult case, physical evidence was scarce. DNA testing was still in its early days, and forensic technology hadn't yet caught up to the brutality of Billy's crimes. Billy tried to strike his own deal with prosecutors, but they refused. He then attempted to plead insanity, another desperate tactic to escape the consequences of his actions. But the jury saw through him. Billy Ray Riggs never admitted his guilt. He never showed remorse. He never uttered Jamie's name with an ounce of humanity. The jury unanimously found him guilty of premeditated murder. They sentenced him to death. Justice, though delayed, was served. For Jamie's grieving family, the verdict brought a small measure of peace. They had lost their bright, trusting daughter to 2 people she had tried to help. Her naivety, her belief in the goodness of strangers, had cost her everything. Hilda Riggs was eventually released from prison in November 2014, after serving her time. Billy Ray Riggs remains on death row to this day. He has filed appeal after appeal, each one denied. His execution date looms ahead, an inevitable conclusion to a life consumed by violence and cruelty. At first, life between Sylvia and Bruce seemed relatively stable, or at least stable enough. But it didn't take long for Bruce's relentless greed to chip away at whatever peace they had built. Sylvia had trusted their shared future. She believed their savings would amount to about $88,000 by 2007. Yet, when she checked their account one afternoon, her heart dropped. Bruce had siphoned nearly everything into his personal account, leaving a pathetic $9,000 behind. The betrayal hit Sylvia like a punch to the chest. Trust, already delicate, shattered. Their marriage, once held together by fragile hopes, started to unravel. And that was just the beginning. As Sylvia dug deeper into Bruce's secrets, she uncovered even more devastating truths. Bruce had been unfaithful for years, weaving lies into the very fabric of their relationship. From the start, he had resisted the idea of having children. He swore he didn't want to be a father. Yet Sylvia eventually learned, not from Bruce, but from his own mother, that he already was a father, to a child he had never even mentioned. Bruce's past offered few explanations for his spiral. His childhood had been normal enough, free from chaos, filled with the typical routines of school and suburban life. He was bright, clever even, and after high school, he moved on to California State University, Northridge, where he studied engineering. His career started strong. Bruce quickly found work as an electrical engineer at a respected research company. Recognition came fast, promotions, pay raises, the applause of his peers. But none of it was enough for Bruce. He watched colleagues earn higher salaries, and instead of feeling pride for his achievements, jealousy poisoned him. The jealousy festered into something worse. To keep up appearances, Bruce began logging false overtime hours, padding his paycheck with hours he never actually worked. Those who knew him best described it as an obsession. Money was his god, and he worshipped it with quiet desperation. Eventually, the lies caught up to him. Bruce was fired in disgrace. Romantic relationships didn't offer him much refuge either. Despite his good looks and easy charm, his relationships often ended just as quickly as they began. Money, or rather, the fear of losing it, was always the wedge that split him from those who got too close. It was during one of these turbulent periods that Bruce met DEA, a colleague who seemed, for a while, to be the one. They talked about marriage. They even planned a wedding. But when DEA envisioned a grand, unforgettable celebration, Bruce saw only dollar signs and waste. Though he had a good job and enough savings to support the occasion, Bruce balked at the costs. DEA, determined to have the wedding she dreamed of, paid for everything herself, from the flowers to the catering to the dress. The wedding day approached. Guests were ready. DEA was ready. But Bruce was gone. Without warning, he emptied $3,000 from their honeymoon fund and disappeared to Palm Springs, blowing the money on his own selfish pleasures. The wedding never happened. Neither did their future. The years that followed told the same story, over and over again. Bruce entered relationships with new women, only to destroy them when money, his one true love, came between them. Each time, he was the common denominator. Each time, he walked away, leaving wreckage behind. At 30, Bruce crossed paths with Elena Luca. She was different, patient, hopeful, forgiving. They married and soon welcomed a son, Matthew, in 2001. But even the birth of a child couldn't ground Bruce. When Matthew was just a year old, tragedy struck. One afternoon, Elena left Matthew in Bruce's care while she ran a few errands. When she returned, the unimaginable had happened. Their baby was floating lifelessly in the backyard pool. Bruce stood there, frozen. He hadn't called 911. He hadn't performed CPR. Nothing. Elena frantically called for help, and by some miracle, doctors managed to restart Matthew's heart. But the damage was done. Matthew suffered catastrophic brain damage. He would be partially paralyzed and dependent on care for the rest of his life. The accident shattered Elena, but Bruce reacted with cold detachment. He seemed disinterested in his son, annoyed by the burden of caring for a disabled child. Before long, Bruce abandoned them both, refusing to provide even basic financial support. Alone, unemployed, and drowning in medical debt that soared past $35,000, Elena was left to pick up the pieces. She begged Bruce for help, but he ignored her, ignored their son. Eventually, a court ordered him to pay a measly $240 a month. It wasn't nearly enough. When Sylvia uncovered the truth about Bruce's past, the lies, the cruelty, the abandonment, she realized she could no longer stay. Divorce was inevitable. The court awarded Sylvia a $10,000 settlement, a fraction of what Bruce had stolen from their joint accounts. He was also ordered to pay monthly alimony, but by then, Bruce's life was unraveling at a terrifying pace. He lost his job. His savings dried up. His once luxurious lifestyle crumbled into dust. And somewhere in the darkness of his mind, a twisted plan began to take shape. As Christmas approached, Bruce made a chilling shopping list: 2 handguns, an air compressor, high-octane fuel, and a custom-made Santa Claus suit. He wasn't planning a festive surprise. He was building a death trap. On December 24, 2008, Bruce carried out his monstrous plan. Wearing the Santa suit, he stormed into a family Christmas party at the home of his former in-laws, the Ortega family. Armed and merciless, Bruce opened fire, slaughtering 9 people, including his ex-wife, before setting the house ablaze with a homemade flamethrower. The devastation was absolute. Hours later, a tip led police to Bruce's rented Dodge Caliber parked near his Pasadena home. Inside, they found a macabre scene: 4 pistols with loaded magazines, 200 rounds of ammunition, food, maps of Mexico and the US, clothing, and a laptop. Bruce had prepared for a getaway. But somewhere along the line, his plan unraveled. In the end, the man who had once clung so desperately to his money and status had nothing left but blood on his hands and a trail of shattered lives behind him. A Christmas night meant for joy became one of horror, all because one man's greed and hatred turned him into a monster. The night ended with 13 children orphaned, their futures shattered before they could even understand the cruelty of it. If fate had been any harsher, it could have been much worse. The massacre struck just hours before a Christmas gathering, a celebration where those children would have been present. Instead, they were spared by a cruel twist of timing. Custody of the surviving children was handed over to relatives who had been untouched by the violence, but no one walked away whole. Among the most heartbreaking stories was that of a young girl named Katrina. She had been standing at the door, beaming with excitement, ready to greet Santa Claus when a single, vicious shot tore through her skull. In a desperate fight against time, surgeons worked furiously to save her life, and somehow, they did. Yet survival came at a steep price. Katrina faced a brutal road to recovery, her life forever altered. Toxicology reports later painted a more disturbing picture. Bruce Parterdow, the man behind the bloodshed, had been heavily intoxicated with illegal substances that night. Whatever darkness brewed inside him, those drugs had only fueled his descent into savagery. As investigators sifted through the wreckage of his life, they found evidence that Bruce had booked a flight for Christmas morning. His mind was a storm of chaos, he switched plans constantly, unable to commit to any single course of action. Just half an hour after the massacre, he bought another ticket, this time to Canada. Maybe he thought he could outrun justice. Maybe he knew it was already too late. Digging deeper, police discovered Bruce had mentioned visiting a close friend in Minnesota. In the days leading up to the murders, he made phone calls, dropped hints about an impromptu visit. Whether it was a sincere plan or a calculated ruse to throw investigators off his trail, no one can say for sure. An even darker secret soon came to light. Bruce had another target in mind, his own biological mother. She had betrayed him in his eyes, revealing to his ex-wife Sylvia the existence of Bruce's disabled child, a child he had fought to keep hidden. Worse still, his mother remained close with Sylvia and the Ortega family, a bond Bruce could not forgive. She was supposed to attend the Christmas party too, but a sudden illness kept her home that night, and, unknowingly, saved her life. People who knew Bruce wrestled with disbelief. He had always seemed calm, even charming. Greedy, sure. Cunning, absolutely. But violence? It had never been part of the man they thought they knew. Investigators pieced together the shards of his broken mind, a devastating divorce, a mountain of debt, job loss, and an insatiable thirst for wealth. It all collided, spiraling Bruce into a nightmare he would never escape. Underscore 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 underscore. Hello again, true crime seekers. Tonight, we turn the page to another chilling story, the story of Angela Wilder. Born in 1985 in San Diego, California, Angela grew up as the youngest daughter in a family rooted in military tradition. Her older sister, Cree, was her anchor, her best friend. But the constant relocations demanded by military life took their toll, stirring unrest beneath the surface of their family. Eventually, the strain cracked the foundation. Angela's parents separated when she was still a schoolgirl. Her mother remarried, and the family relocated to the quiet town of Phoenix City, Alabama. No more uniforms, no more deployments, just small-town life and Sundays at the local church. In high school, Angela found her first love. His name was Christopher Jackson, and for a time, he was her entire world. But young love met a crossroads when Angela made a decision. Her education came first. She moved away to attend the University of South Alabama, and though Christopher's heart broke, he respected her choice. By 2004, life had taken Angela down a new path. She met Daniel, the son of a preacher. Their relationship bloomed quickly, and when Angela found herself pregnant, marriage seemed the only answer. Their vows were spoken, their daughter was born, but reality soon darkened the fairy tale. Financial troubles, long work hours, and unmet expectations poisoned their bond. Within 2 years, Angela filed for divorce, determined to build a better life for herself and her child. Graduation brought her back to familiar streets, back to the home of her mother and sister, who gladly helped shoulder the burden of single motherhood. One evening, while attending church, Angela crossed paths with an old classmate, Richie Wilder. Richie had a reputation. A hair-trigger temper, a cloud of trouble that followed him everywhere. Rumors whispered about an abusive upbringing, an alcoholic father, a mother trapped in fear. Most people kept their distance. But Angela, she saw something different. She saw potential, something worth saving. Their relationship blossomed in the beginning. Richie was kind to Angela's daughter, attentive to Angela herself. But beneath the smiles and quiet moments, a darker reality lurked. Angela's family noticed it first. She grew quieter, more anxious. Stress clung to her like a second skin. They warned her to walk away before it was too late, but Angela believed love could change him. In January 2009, against the advice of those who loved her, Angela married Richie. Together with her daughter, they moved to Minot, North Dakota, a small, tightly knit community with deep military ties. Richie was stationed at the local military base, while Angela started work at a supply store on the grounds. It didn't take long for cracks to appear. Co-workers noticed Richie's cutting remarks, the way Angela's eyes sometimes brimmed with tears. Behind closed doors, the abuse escalated. He was careful, leaving no bruises that could be seen, no scars visible to the outside world, but the wounds ran deep. 2 children followed, a son and another daughter. But the dream of family crumbled under the weight of fear. When Angela finally found the strength to report the abuse, it was as though a dam had burst. Years of silent suffering came pouring out. Investigators listened, stunned by the quiet horror she had endured. And Richie Wilder's story, the man who once seemed broken but salvageable, was about to take a turn so dark, so tragic, that the town of Minot would never forget. Richie was a master manipulator, and sadly, he had a lot of support behind him. His colleagues at the military base stood by him without question, and the base management wasn't any different. They all rallied behind Richie as he painted his wife, Angela, as unstable, someone battling serious mental health problems. Angela, on the other hand, found herself trapped in a nightmare. She didn't have enough solid evidence to prove the mistreatment she endured behind closed doors, and with Richie's powerful allies covering for him, her cries for help were muffled into silence. Still, Angela wasn't ready to surrender. She was determined to break free and fight for the custody of her 2 children. But the road ahead wasn't easy. Richie fought dirty. He turned the tables on Angela, accusing her of having anger management issues, and with the military base's unwavering support, he managed to make those accusations stick. The pressure mounted against her. Angela, a mother who had never once shown aggression to her friends or family, was forced to attend anger management classes and was prescribed sedatives. Those closest to Angela knew the truth. They swore they had never seen her lose her temper, not once. They believed Richie had orchestrated the entire charade, manipulating the system to discredit her, to make her seem like the villain. Still, Angela, determined not to give Richie any more ammunition, followed the court's orders. She attended the sessions and took the medication, hoping that by complying, she could finally find some peace. 2 weeks after a fragile reconciliation between Angela and Richie, things crumbled once again. Angela filed for divorce, unable to ignore the storm brewing in her home. Their marriage officially ended in May 2012. Richie, for all the shields he once hid behind, finally faced a military tribunal. Against strong opposition from officers at the base, Angela stood tall and exposed the violence she and the children suffered. The truth shattered the illusion Richie had built. He was dismissed from military service, his reputation stained forever. Angela planned a new beginning. She decided to move back home to Alabama with her children, far away from the painful memories Richie had left behind. But Richie wasn't willing to let go. He fought bitterly, wanting to maintain a relationship with the kids, demanding weekend visits and regular contact. Their arguments grew fiercer. Richie even threatened Angela more than once, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Despite everything, Angela pushed forward. During the 2014 World Cup, she told her loved ones about her plans to move. No matter the threats, no matter the fear that crept into her heart at night, she chose her children's safety and her own peace of mind over everything else. Meanwhile, Richie also moved, not far from Angela, and tried to start fresh. He found work as a junior staff member at a hospital and soon met Cynthia Becker, a kindergarten teacher. Their relationship moved quickly. Marriage followed, and a new family life began for Richie. But even as he wore a new wedding band, Richie's obsession with Angela and the children didn't fade. He stayed in touch with his son and daughter through sporadic phone calls, but the wounds between him and Angela never truly healed. The custody battles continued to cast a long shadow over them. Angela, on the other hand, was beginning to find her happiness again. She had reconnected with her high school sweetheart, Christopher Jackson. They had once separated so she could chase her dreams of higher education, but fate had led them back to each other. Their love reignited stronger than ever. Angela often told her family how she had finally found warmth, a safe place for her heart to rest. She and Christopher had a son together, and now, she was expecting another child. They were planning their wedding, dreaming about a future together. Angela had fought hard to reach this moment, but fate had a cruel twist in store for her. On the night of November 13, 2015, Christopher left for his overnight shift at a 24-hour Walmart. Without a car, he usually relied on Angela to pick him up after his shift ended at 7 a.m. Throughout his shifts, they would often exchange texts and calls, small moments of love across the hours. But that night, something felt wrong. Around 3 a.m., Angela sent a chilling text. She heard strange noises outside. She felt like someone was following her. Christopher didn't see the message immediately. Work kept him busy. When he finally read her words 2 hours later, panic surged through him. He tried calling, again and again, but Angela never answered. At first, he tried to stay calm. Maybe she had gone to the hospital for a checkup, considering her pregnancy. Maybe their son wasn't feeling well. But deep down, he knew, this wasn't like Angela. If she had left for an emergency, she would have called him, texted him, anything. The minutes stretched unbearably long. Fear gnawed at his gut. When Angela didn't show up to pick him up, Christopher rushed home, praying he was overreacting. As he approached the house, dread crawled up his spine. The back door, it looked damaged, as if it had been forced open. He knocked on the bedroom window, calling out Angela's name into the cold, still morning. No answer. He didn't dare go inside. His instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. Instead, he called 911, explaining the situation in a shaky voice. The dispatcher urged him to stay outside. If someone dangerous was inside, going in could mean walking into a trap. Christopher could do nothing but wait, standing outside, heart pounding against his ribs, praying for Angela and their unborn child. 20 minutes later, the police arrived. Together, they moved cautiously toward the house. From the outside, nothing seemed out of place, the furniture undisturbed, everything eerily still. But as officers reached the main bedroom and pushed open the door, the nightmare became a reality. One officer flicked on the light. The walls, the floor, the bed, they were soaked in blood. Angela wasn't asleep. Angela wasn't safe. She had fought, and lost. The room was a scene of pure horror. Blood-soaked linens were tangled into a crimson mess, and on the bed, the lifeless body of 30-year-old Angela lay motionless. She had been stabbed repeatedly, viciously, the brutality of the attack leaving no doubt that this was deeply personal. Somehow, in the midst of this violence, Angela's 2-year-old son was still inside the house. Silent. No cries, no screams from his room. When Christopher, Angela's boyfriend, rushed to check on him, he found the boy fast asleep, untouched by the nightmare that had unfolded just rooms away. Thankfully, the other children had been with their grandmother that day. In a panic, without hesitation, Christopher pointed his finger at one man, Richie, Angela's ex-husband. Christopher was convinced there was no one else who would harm Angela in such a savage way. Angela didn't have enemies. But she did have Richie. After their bitter divorce, Angela had won full custody of their 2 children, who were 10 and 4 years old at the time. Richie, however, still had visitation rights. It had always been a fragile arrangement. Richie had dreams of taking the children away permanently, of winning custody and raising them on his own. But Angela had fought him at every turn, unwilling to let a man she described as cruel and unstable have that kind of influence over their lives. Their battles were not just legal, they were emotional, explosive. Angela's sister, Crystal, later told detectives that Richie had once forced his way into Angela's home after the divorce was finalized, warning her coldly that if he wanted to get to her, he could. But he was clever, he never crossed the line in public. He kept his threats private, unrecorded, unseen. Without concrete proof, Angela had been left to live with the constant fear on her own. When the forensic team examined Angela's body, their findings were even more horrifying than expected. Angela had endured over 1,000 stab wounds. Her hands were shredded with defensive cuts, clear evidence that she had fought for her life until the very last breath. The house showed no signs of robbery. Valuables were left untouched. This wasn't about money. This was about rage. About revenge. About hatred. Investigators dove into Angela's personal life and quickly discovered the deep, toxic history between her and Richie. It turned out Richie had even been discharged from the military for violent behavior, including incidents against Angela and their children. Family members described the relationship as volatile and dangerous. Angela had gone to great lengths to avoid Richie during custody exchanges, often sending Christopher to deal with him instead. Even Christopher spoke openly about his dislike for Richie, recalling how he could feel the man's barely contained anger every time they interacted. The detectives knew where their focus needed to be. They zeroed in on Richie. When questioned, Richie was calm. Too calm. He denied any involvement in Angela's murder. Without hard evidence in hand, detectives couldn't confront him aggressively. So they listened. Richie claimed he had left work around 7 p.m. and had spent the entire evening at home with his new wife, Cynthia, who backed up his story. But the investigators couldn't ignore the fresh scratches on Richie's hands and face, scratches that looked very much like the kind someone might get when fighting off a desperate, dying woman. Richie casually dismissed them, blaming them on roughhousing with a child. Detectives weren't buying it. They pulled surveillance footage from nearby cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of Richie's car. No direct evidence surfaced, but that didn't rule him out. A determined killer could easily park out of sight. They collected Richie's DNA and searched his car. The interior was spotless, suspiciously spotless. Except for one thing, a small red stain on the passenger door. Forensics carefully collected it for testing. As pressure mounted, Richie agreed to take a polygraph test, but then never showed up. A glaring red flag, but still not enough for an arrest. In the meantime, Richie's world was unraveling. He was fired from his job at a hospital just weeks after Angela's death, following accusations that he had shoved an elderly patient. Richie tried to claim that stress from the police investigation had pushed him over the edge. Meanwhile, evidence against him was building slowly but surely. DNA tests came back, and they were damning. Richie's genetic material was found in Angela's bedroom, matching the profile collected from under her fingernails, where she had clawed desperately during the fight for her life. When confronted, Richie clung to a flimsy excuse. He said that maybe traces of his DNA had lingered from an earlier custody exchange, an innocent, accidental transfer. But the timeline didn't add up. Angela had no direct contact with Richie during their most recent exchanges, only Christopher had dealt with him. Worse yet, the blood stain in Richie's car door was tested. It wasn't just blood, it was fresh blood. Angela's blood. Richie tried to explain it away by suggesting she used to suffer nosebleeds when they were married, but no one believed that story, least of all the seasoned detectives who had heard it all before. Every conversation with Richie revealed more contradictions. More lies. More desperation. Finally, after months of painstaking investigation, the police arrested Richie for Angela's murder. He protested, loudly and repeatedly. And then, in an unexpected twist, Richie offered a confession. But not the kind the police had expected. Richie insisted he wasn't guilty, but he hinted that he knew who was. Someone else, he claimed, had been involved in Angela's death. A dark turn in a case already dripping with betrayal, obsession, and bloodshed. And the investigation was far from over. It started with a strange proposal, one that Richie would later wish he had never agreed to. One evening, Christopher approached him with an idea that sounded more like a plot from a late-night crime drama than real life. He told Richie he was certain Angela, his wife, was cheating on him while he worked the night shift. Christopher wasn't just suspicious, he was obsessed with catching her in the act. He promised that if they could prove her infidelity, Richie could use it as leverage in a custody battle for his own children. The deal was simple, or so it seemed: catch Angela red-handed, win a war. Richie agreed. It didn't take much convincing. Anger and desperation have a way of clouding judgment. That same evening, Richie called Christopher to pick him up from work. They drove silently to Angela's house, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. Their plan was to confront her and whoever she was with. They even brought a knife, telling themselves it was for self-defense, though deep down, a darker possibility lingered. When they quietly entered Angela's bedroom, the scene was nothing like they had imagined. There was no lover. No whispered conversations or hurried movements. Just Angela, sleeping peacefully, unaware that death was stalking her just beyond the door. And then, without warning, Christopher snapped. The knife they brought glinted in the dim light as he lunged forward, stabbing Angela over and over. Her eyes flew open in terror. She tried to fight back, struggling with every ounce of strength she had, but it wasn't enough. Richie stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer horror of what was happening. His mind screamed at him to stop it, to do something, anything, but his body betrayed him. After what felt like an eternity, Christopher turned to Richie, his face wild, and hissed a warning: if he ever breathed a word of what happened, he and his family would die. In the heavy silence that followed, Richie numbly stepped closer to Angela's crumpled body. He reached out, trembling, to check for a pulse. That's when Angela, with a final burst of life, grabbed his hand, scratching him as she tried desperately to survive. But the fight was already lost. She collapsed once more, still and silent. Shaken to his core and terrified of Christopher's threats, Richie fled into the night, carrying the weight of his silence like a noose tightening around his neck. For a while, Richie kept his mouth shut. When the police first brought him in for questioning, He clung to his lies, too scared to tell the truth. He insisted he knew nothing. When pressed harder, he spun even wilder tales. He claimed he saw a masked intruder, a shadowy figure sent by one of Angela's enemies, slip into the house and kill her. He pointed fingers at his fellow inmates, saying they had confessed to the crime in whispered jailhouse confessions. But the stories didn't add up. Investigators soon dismantled Richie's version of events. Surveillance footage showed Christopher working his night shift on Martyr Street from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., never leaving the building. Cell phone records confirmed Christopher's story. He clocked out, called a taxi, and went straight home. Backed into a corner, Richie grew more desperate. He tried bribing a fellow inmate with $500,000 to take the fall for Angela's murder. When that failed, he plotted something even darker, offering the same amount to arrange for Christopher's death. Luckily, the inmate he tried to recruit had no interest in becoming a killer for hire. In custody, Richie's erratic behavior raised even more red flags. Correctional officers noticed him acting suspiciously and found a sharpened broom handle hidden in his cell, a makeshift spear, ready for an escape attempt. His plans were foiled, but the discovery sealed his fate even tighter. By the time his trial for Angela Wilder's murder began in December 2016, the prosecution had a mountain of evidence. Forensic experts testified that a drop of blood found in Richie's car matched Angela's DNA. Scratches under her fingernails matched Richie's DNA too, chilling proof that she had fought for her life. Despite his lawyer's best efforts to cast doubt, the jury saw through it. Richie Wilder was found guilty of premeditated murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 5 years for his failed escape attempt. Not everyone believed in his guilt, though. A woman close to Richie, someone who knew him well, insisted the police had it wrong. She painted Richie as a kind-hearted man, a loving father, incapable of such brutality. She claimed he was with her the night of Angela's death, but her words were no match for the hard evidence against him. The tragedy shattered more lives than just Richie's and Angela's. Overnight, their children lost both parents. Richie's new wife, Cynthia, who had once dreamed of building a family with him, was left alone, bitter and convinced he had been wrongly imprisoned. But the case didn't end there. Cynthia's loyalty turned into something darker. She frequently vented her frustrations to a close friend, unable to hide her resentment over Richie's capture. During one conversation, she slipped, mentioning that Richie was supposed to shoot Angela, but changed his mind and used a knife instead. That was information only someone closely tied to the crime would know. Sensing something was off, Cynthia's friend agreed to help the police by allowing their conversations to be recorded. In a chilling, almost casual chat, Cynthia revealed the depth of her anger, not at the murder itself, but at how poorly Richie had covered his tracks. She bitterly complained that he should have burned down the house, destroyed the evidence, even cut off Angela's fingers to prevent identification. She also admitted that they had tried to clean Richie's car together but missed a single drop of blood, the very mistake that ultimately helped convict him. In the end, justice for Angela Wilder wasn't just about Richie's conviction. It was about peeling back the lies, the twisted loyalties, and the desperate attempts to bury the truth. And it was a grim reminder that sometimes, the monsters don't lurk in the shadows, they sit beside you, hiding behind familiar faces, smiling as they plot destruction. Cynthia had a philosophy she lived by: if you were going to commit a crime, it had to be flawless. No mistakes. No witnesses. No evidence. She spoke often, almost obsessively, about the art of getting away with it, the thrill of being smarter than the law. In private conversations, Cynthia eventually confessed that the murder of Angela wasn't a spur-of-the-moment tragedy. It was cold, calculated. She and Richie had plotted it for months, letting the hatred simmer and sharpen their resolve. Richie couldn't stomach the idea of sharing custody with Angela. In his twisted mind, murder seemed like the cleanest way out. Cynthia wasn't there when Richie carried out the brutal attack. Her hands didn't wield the weapon, but her fingerprints were all over the planning. Later, Damning audio recordings surfaced, recordings that would land right into the hands of police investigators. In 2018, Cynthia was arrested. As she sat in court, facing a sea of cold stares and unspoken judgment, she spun a desperate story. She claimed the recordings were lies, a cruel setup. According to her, she had fabricated the entire confession to impress a man she wanted to date. She said she thought painting herself as a criminal mastermind would win his admiration. But law enforcement didn't buy it. The investigators pointed out something chilling: Cynthia wasn't just telling stories. She had insider knowledge of the crime. Details only someone deeply involved would know. She had the opportunity to prevent the murder but stood by, silent. Watching. Enabling. Prosecutors offered her a plea deal, 25 years in exchange for a guilty plea. Cynthia refused, gambling on the idea that without physical evidence, only her own haunting words, they couldn't convict her. She gambled and lost. Further investigation unveiled even darker truths. Cynthia hadn't just been a passive planner, she had helped clean up after the slaughter, hiding evidence and ensuring Richie's bloody trail disappeared. When Richie later tried to break out of prison in 2016, guess who was caught helping from the outside? Cynthia. The courts threw everything they had at her. She was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and attempting to aid an escape. Like Richie, Cynthia was sentenced to life without the hope of parole. They appealed, desperate for a second chance, but the judges weren't interested. Their convictions stood firm. After the trials, Angela's mother became the children's legal guardian. The kids moved to Jacksonville, Florida, to start over, carrying the weight of unspeakable loss. The courts decided Richie would have no contact with his children, at least, not until they were old enough to decide for themselves whether they wanted to face the man who tore their lives apart. Underscore 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 underscore. But the darkness doesn't end there. If you're ready for more, let's dive into another chilling story, the tragic case of Jennifer Ehrman and Elizabeth Paya. Jennifer, born August 15, 1978, and Elizabeth, born June 21, 1977, were inseparable best friends growing up in Houston, Texas. Their friendship was the kind that most people only dream of: sisterly, loyal, pure. Jennifer was everything good in a person: positive, caring, sharp-witted. Elizabeth, too, had a vibrant spirit and a kindness that turned strangers into friends. Their parents beamed with pride whenever they spoke of their daughters. Together, Jennifer and Elizabeth dreamed big, filling their days with basketball games, shared secrets, and endless laughter. June 24, 1993, started like any other carefree summer evening. The girls were buzzing with excitement, preparing for a pool party at their friend Gina's house. Jennifer's father, Randy, dropped her off at Elizabeth's home around 4:45 p.m. They spent hours getting ready, picking out outfits, doing makeup, giggling like only teenage girls can. Elizabeth's mother drove them to the party around 8 p.m. Their curfew was a strict 11:30 p.m., a rule they always respected. But that night, time slipped away from them, lost between cannonballs into the pool and whispered conversations under the stars. By 2 a.m., panic set in. They were hours past curfew. They had two options to get home: take the main road, a safer, albeit longer route, or cut through a dark park and across the train tracks to save time. They chose the shortcut. In those days, no one thought twice about walking home alone at night. Cell phones were rare, and most people still believed their neighborhoods were safe havens. Doors were left unlocked. Trust was the norm, not the exception. But evil doesn't need an invitation. It lurks in the shadows, waiting. As Jennifer and Elizabeth hurried through the park, their laughter probably softened into nervous whispers. They crossed the deserted railway embankment, their silhouettes swallowed by darkness. Meanwhile, back home, Jennifer's mother woke around 4 a.m. Something gnawed at her, a mother's instinct. She noticed the bedroom light still glowing and found Jennifer's bed empty. Her heart dropped. She called Elizabeth's house, hoping Jennifer had stayed the night. No answer. She tried reaching Gina's family, but the line just rang and rang. Growing frantic, Jennifer's parents rushed to Elizabeth's house, then to Gina's, desperately searching, asking anyone who would listen. Gina confirmed the terrifying truth: the girls had left her house around 2 a.m. They never made it home. The darkness that swallowed Jennifer and Elizabeth that night wasn't just the absence of light, it was the presence of something far worse. It wasn't until late that night when panic truly set in. Jennifer's parents realized they hadn't seen her since early evening, and Elizabeth's family was just as frantic. The unease quickly turned into terror. Without wasting a second, they dialed 911, voices trembling, to report both girls missing. The police took the call seriously. 2 young girls, gone after dark, with no warning, it wasn't something to brush off. The thought that Jennifer and Elizabeth had simply run away was dismissed almost immediately. Their wallets, phones, even the little things like their favorite jackets, all still sitting untouched at home. They had no reason to disappear. Both came from loving, stable families. They had plans, futures, not a single clue pointed to them leaving willingly. As police began their search, the families launched a desperate campaign of their own. They printed flyers, handed out photos at gas stations, and knocked on every door in the neighborhood. They asked anyone and everyone, "Have you seen them?" 2 girls, around 18, out after dark. But no one had seen anything. No odd cars. No screams. No shadows in the night. For agonizing days passed, each one colder than the last. Each hour without news was another weight on their chests. Tips came into the police station, wild claims, whispered rumors, but none led anywhere. And the crucial first 48 hours, the golden window for finding someone alive, had already slipped away. On the 4th day, just when hope was starting to crack under the pressure of reality, the police received a call that changed everything. An anonymous voice on the line. Shaky. Short. Terrified. He said he knew where the girls were. A clearing, deep in the woods behind the old park. A shortcut Jennifer and Elizabeth might have taken that night. Officers rushed to the location. The directions were vague, but the woods were dense and eerie, and somewhere out there, the girls were waiting to be found. They crossed an abandoned railway line, the gravel crunching under their boots. And then they saw it. From a distance, 2 shapes, lying unnaturally still in a patch of tall grass surrounded by trees. As they got closer, dread hardened into horror. 2 bodies. Side by side. Left out in the open, stripped of their clothing, the summer heat accelerating the devastation. It was almost impossible to tell who they were at first. Insects swarmed, and the scent of decay hung heavy in the air. Around them, the ground was a chaotic mess, fresh footprints stamped into the dirt, signs of dragging, and broken branches where a struggle had taken place. The brutality of it was worse than anyone had dared imagine. News spread fast, faster than the officers could contain it. Jennifer's father was giving a live interview when a reporter nearby blurted out the discovery. He froze, mid-sentence, his heart breaking before his mind could catch up. Without hesitation, he sped to the scene, desperate, out of control. He fought against the police lines, screaming, "Is she blonde? Does she have long hair? Please, tell me." But the officers could only shake their heads, helpless. The bodies were too far gone for immediate identification. The investigation shifted quickly into grim territory. The medical examiner's office took over, using dental records to confirm what everyone already feared deep in their bones. The bodies belonged to Jennifer Mann and Elizabeth Pyatt. Both 18 years old. both full of life just days before. As forensic teams scoured the scene, they found more evidence, dozens of footprints, overlapping and tangled. It was clear more than one person had been there, several, in fact, but separating the prints was nearly impossible. Autopsy reports confirmed the horrifying truth: both girls had died from strangulation. At the time, DNA testing was still a relatively new science, and databases for comparison didn't exist yet. The evidence would have to speak for itself. And then came a breakthrough. The anonymous caller who led them to the bodies, he seemed to know too much. Police traced the call to a small house in a rundown part of town. There, they found Joe Cantu, who quickly crumbled under questioning. He admitted he had made the call. But what he revealed next sent shockwaves through the entire investigation. Joe confessed that his own brother, Peter Cantu, along with 5 of his friends, had ambushed and attacked Jennifer and Elizabeth that night. A search of the house turned up chilling evidence: girls' jewelry tucked away like trophies, and later confirmed by the families as belonging to the victims. Traces of the girls' DNA were found on several items. Piece by piece, the nightmare unraveled. It had started around 2 a.m. Jennifer and Elizabeth were walking home through the park, taking a shortcut like they had done countless times before. Elizabeth was a few steps ahead, her shoes crunching lightly on the gravel path. They didn't hear them at first. Lurking in the shadows were 6 boys, members of a local gang, their ages ranging from 14 to 18. The ringleader was Peter Cantu, 18, joined by Jose Medi, Derek Sean O'Brien, Efrain Perez, Viniel Medi, and Raul Vriel. Jose was the first to move, stepping out of the darkness and lunging for Elizabeth. She tried to run. God, she tried. She dodged him at first, sprinting faster, but he caught up, grabbing her roughly by the neck and dragging her off the path, into the trees. Jennifer, hearing Elizabeth's cries, turned back. Without thinking, without a second's hesitation, she rushed to help her friend. It was a fatal mistake. She didn't know what waited in the dark. Didn't know that Jose wasn't alone. Didn't know there were 6 of them. The group overwhelmed them both, forcing them to the ground. The girls fought back, clawing, kicking, screaming, but they were outnumbered, and the gang was merciless. They tore at their clothes and subjected them to unimaginable horrors for over an hour. Forensic evidence would later reveal the ferocity of the girls' resistance: fingernail scratches, defensive wounds. They didn't go down without a fight. Not for a second. By the end, the gang had decided the girls couldn't be left alive. They strangled them, slowly, and left their battered bodies in the clearing like discarded trash. For days later, under the unforgiving summer sun, the world finally found them. But it was too late. The night was far from over for Elizabeth and Jennifer, and as terror gripped them, they fought back with everything they had. Their attackers, ruthless and merciless, were relentless. The girls scratched, kicked, and bit in a desperate attempt to survive, leaving behind marks that would later become crucial evidence. The police would find these marks on their attackers, bite marks and scratches that told the tale of a fight for life. But despite their bravery, it was not enough to save them. Peter Cantu, the leader of the gang, an 18-year-old with a cruel heart, knew that leaving the girls alive was a risk. He feared they would identify him, leading to his capture. In a moment of chilling resolve, he ordered his gang to silence them. "Kill them," he commanded. And so, the nightmare for Elizabeth and Jennifer intensified. Raul, one of the gang members, seized Jennifer. He forced her to kneel before him. Exhausted and scared, she obeyed, and as she knelt there, Derek and Raul wrapped a red belt around her neck. They tightened it with all their strength, choking her until the belt snapped. But even then, they weren't satisfied. They continued their savage work, using shoelaces to strangle her, ensuring her lifeless body would never rise again. All the while, Elizabeth was forced to watch the horrific scene unfold before her eyes. The realization that she was next struck her like a bolt of lightning. Desperate, she pleaded for her life, promising not to report them if they spared her. But her cries fell on deaf ears. The criminals remained cold, their hearts devoid of mercy. With all the strength she had left, Elizabeth tried to flee, but her attackers caught up with her quickly. They knocked her to the ground and began kicking her mercilessly. Bones cracked under the force of the blows, ribs shattered, teeth knocked loose. And then, just like Jennifer, they strangled her with shoelaces, stepping on her throat to make sure she wouldn't survive. The cruel gang members showed no remorse. After ensuring the girls were dead, they rifled through their belongings, taking jewelry and money, leaving the bodies to be found later. The gang, except for Derek, then made their way to Peter Cantu's house. His younger brother, Joe, and Joe's wife, Christina, were there, unaware of the bloodshed that had just taken place. Christina noticed that the boys had returned later than usual, their clothes stained with blood. They seemed weary, nervous, and on edge, like animals after a hunt. When she asked what had happened, they dismissed it casually, claiming it was just some fun. But their laughter, dark and twisted, told another story. Jose, one of the gang members, proudly mentioned how much easier it would have been to kill the girls if he'd had a gun. Joe and Christina, though horrified, didn't confront them right away. They listened, gathering every detail, trying to understand the full extent of the depravity their family was involved in. Later, as the gang members split up the stolen goods, Joe and Christina were left alone, their minds racing. Christina, having survived the horrors of her own past, was deeply shaken by what she'd just heard. She knew that these criminals could not be allowed to continue their reign of terror. She convinced Joe that they needed to go to the police, that their silence could mean more innocent lives lost. Joe hesitated, terrified of what the gang might do if they found out he'd turned them in. But Christina reassured him, they could report anonymously, protecting their identities. On the fourth day after Elizabeth and Jennifer disappeared, Joe's decision led to the discovery of their bodies. The police pieced together the evidence, linking the gang members to the crime. The stolen jewelry, including a ring that belonged to Elizabeth, was found, along with the red belt, still tied in a knot, at Peter's home. The belt had been the murder weapon. When police arrested Derek on June 29, 1993, he tried to flee but was quickly caught. The truth came out as he was surrounded. In his attempt to save face, he admitted that he had given Jose the red belt to strangle Jennifer. He even kept a piece of it as a sick memento. Police soon found DNA evidence at his home, further implicating him in the brutal murders. Raul, who had only recently joined the gang, was also arrested. With the evidence piling up, and the testimony from informants, all the gang members were charged with double murder, rape, and torture. The families of the victims endured the harrowing details of the crime in the courtroom, seeking justice for their daughters. Jennifer's father, utterly devastated, later recalled seeing Derek smile at him as he stood over the crime scene, taunting him with his casual indifference. That smile, that wave, it was a cruel reminder of how little Derek thought of the lives he had taken. It wasn't until later that Jennifer's father realized the true depth of the taunt. The court proceedings were intense, and justice was pursued with fierce determination. 5 of the 6 gang members were sentenced to death. The only one to escape that fate was 14-year-old Vino Medi, who had cooperated with the authorities and testified against the others. Because he was a minor, Vino received a 40-year sentence, with the possibility of parole when he turned 54. The case didn't end there. A chilling connection to another crime emerged. 6 months before the murders of Elizabeth and Jennifer, a young girl named Patricia Lopez had been brutally raped, tortured, and dismembered. Her body was discovered near the same forest where the 2 girls' bodies were later found. Investigators began to wonder if Derek and Effine were responsible for her death as well. DNA evidence from Patricia's body was analyzed, and it became clear that these criminals had been part of a much larger pattern of violence. This story, a horrific reminder of how darkness can overtake a soul, will forever be etched in the minds of those who knew Elizabeth and Jennifer. For their families, justice was hard-won, but the scars left by that brutal night would never fully heal. The case had been sitting in the files for years. It wasn't until a fresh re-examination of the evidence that the truth started to unravel. Hidden within the evidence collected at the scene, male DNA was uncovered, and it matched Jose's. Alongside it, investigators found a discarded beer can, its surface smeared with fingerprints. One print, clear as day, belonged to Derek. Despite this damning discovery, Derek was never formally charged with Patricia's murder. Later, in a recorded confession, he admitted he had been there when Patricia was killed. But he insisted he was too drunk to understand what was happening around him, claiming he never participated in the cruel torture she endured. The authorities faced a painful dilemma: there simply wasn't enough evidence to convict him for the massacre itself. Given the severity of the double homicide for which he had already received a death sentence, they chose not to pursue additional charges. During the trial, much of the scrutiny shifted onto Raul Viral, a young man who had been drawn into the gang that fateful night. Raul's attorneys fought to separate his actions from those of Peter Cantu, the gang's merciless leader. They painted Raul as a scared follower, someone who hadn't laid a hand on the victims during the night of terror. And they succeeded in convincing the jury that Raul, while present, hadn't participated in the unimaginable violence. Yet, his choice to stay, to watch, and to do nothing weighed heavily against him. This case didn't just shake a community, it sent shockwaves through the entire country. It was the first time in American history that defendants were sentenced to death for crimes of this nature. The brutal details dominated headlines, leaving a scar on the city and inspiring fear that would linger for years. Families locked their doors earlier. Strangers crossed the street at the sight of unfamiliar faces. Trust was broken, replaced with a wary vigilance. The families of Elizabeth and Jennifer, the young women whose lives had been stolen so violently, showed a heartbreaking resilience. They sat through every trial, every hearing, and even the executions, determined to bear witness to the justice their daughters deserved. In July 2006, Derek, one of the perpetrators, was executed. Of all the defendants, he alone expressed genuine remorse. Moments before his death, he apologized to the victims' families, calling his actions the greatest mistake of his life. But forgiveness did not come easily. Jennifer's father, Randy, stood firm. Despite Derek's final words, Randy's pain remained raw, a wound that time could not close. Opponents of the death penalty rallied, claiming that lethal injection was a cruel and unusual punishment. Wealthy advocates and human rights groups demanded change. But the families of Elizabeth and Jennifer held a different view. To them, nothing could be crueler than what had been done to their daughters. After testifying about the unimaginable horror Jennifer suffered before her death, Randy made no attempt to hide his feelings. On the day of Derek's execution, he boldly declared that he wished Derek could experience the same fear and pain that Jennifer had endured. As the legal battles continued, a new controversy erupted around Jose Medi. A Mexican citizen, Jose had never contacted his consulate for protection before his trial, a right he had under the Vienna Convention. Mexico filed an international lawsuit against the United States, arguing that his defense had been compromised. The case grew even more complicated as human rights organizations jumped in, and media outlets around the world followed every twist and turn. In 2005, President George W. Bush ordered that hearings be held. But Texas, proud and stubborn, refused to comply. The governor brought the matter to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled that only Congress could make such decisions. The International Court of Justice tried to intervene, demanding that Jose's execution be paused until a proper hearing was held. Texas, however, remained defiant. Despite international pressure and protests led by death penalty opponents, Jose's fate was sealed. On August 5, 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court dismissed his final appeal. 2 weeks later, on August 17, 2010, Jose Medi was executed, 2 years after Derek's death. Just before he faced his fate, Peter Cantu, the gang's ringleader, also met his end after delivering a final statement. For the families, it wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about ensuring that the monsters who had stolen their daughters never walked free again. They found some measure of peace in the knowledge that the worst of them had paid the ultimate price. Not all of the gang members met the same fate, however. Raoul Vellier, the young recruit, was spared the death penalty when the U.S. Supreme Court banned executions for juveniles. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in 2029, a looming date that haunted the victims' families. The tragedy left an indelible mark on Houston, forcing the city to confront the growing threat of gang violence. In an effort to honor Elizabeth and Jennifer's memory, 2 memorials were created, one at the scene of the crime, the other at their school, standing as silent reminders of lives taken far too soon. Randy became a fierce advocate for victims' rights. He vowed that juvenile offenders guilty of such atrocities should never walk free, and he spent the rest of his life fighting to make that belief a reality. He lobbied tirelessly to change the laws, to give victims' families a stronger voice in court. Thanks to his efforts, family members could now speak at sentencing hearings, and they were finally allowed to witness the executions of those who had caused them so much grief. Randy's crusade made him a polarizing figure. Some admired his strength, others criticized his relentless pursuit of justice. But to Randy, the cause was simple: no family should have to suffer in silence. Sadly, in 2014, Randy passed away after a battle with lung cancer at the age of 61. But his legacy lived on. His advocacy reshaped victims' rights in Texas, giving other grieving families a platform he had once been denied. Today, the remaining gang members still sit behind bars, clinging to fading hopes of parole. Time and time again, their requests have been denied. And thanks to Randy's unwavering efforts, and the memories of 2 innocent young women, those prison doors are unlikely to ever open. It started with a troubling sight. Roxana's parents had seen their 15-year-old daughter in a car with Michael, a man significantly older than her. They knew something was wrong. Alarm bells went off instantly, but despite their growing fears, authorities didn't step in. Roxana's parents were terrified for their daughter. They could see the manipulation, the control. They didn't want her life ruined before it even truly began. Desperate to protect her, they made the painful decision to take legal action against Michael, hoping the courts could save their child from him. When Roxana learned about their plan, she broke down. She pleaded with her parents, begged them not to move forward. But they remained steadfast. They had to do what was right, even if their daughter couldn't see it. This decision set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted, a spiral into darkness that would leave their family shattered. Michael, fully aware that Roxana's parents were building a case against him, was furious. Together, he and Roxana fantasized about running away, starting a new life far away from the controlling eyes of her family. But there was a problem: they had no money, no safe place to go. And they knew Roxana's parents would never stop searching for her. Driven by desperation and twisted by love, they devised a horrifying plan: they would eliminate the obstacle, her family. It was the early morning hours of October 17, 2014, around 2 a.m., when 15-year-old Roxana crept into her younger brother's bedroom. Clutching a kitchen knife tightly in her hand, her heart pounded in her chest. Her 12-year-old brother slept peacefully, unaware of the danger standing over him. Roxana placed her hand over his mouth and, without hesitation, drove the blade into his throat. The boy awoke in agony, letting out a muffled, blood-curdling scream. Panicking, Roxana left him bleeding and stumbled toward her 11-year-old sister's room. But before she could reach her next victim, her parents, awakened by the horrifying sounds, rushed to their son's room, and what they saw froze them in terror. Blood. Panic. Chaos. They raced to Roxana's room, only to find her standing by her bed, the bloodied knife still in her hand. She was frozen, almost catatonic. Her father, Jeffrey, lunged at her, grabbing the knife and holding her tightly. Meanwhile, outside the house, Michael was waiting, anxiously texting Roxana for updates. As the parents frantically called 911, Roxana wrestled free and made a daring escape, leaping out of her bedroom window to reunite with Michael. They disappeared into the night together. Paramedics arrived swiftly and managed to save the young boy's life. He would later make a full recovery, but the emotional scars would be harder to heal. A manhunt began immediately. Roxana and Michael were placed on the wanted list. It didn't take long before they were found hiding out in Michael's Detroit apartment, where they were planning their future, even their wedding. But the horrifying truth soon came out. This wasn't just a rash act of violence, it was a premeditated plan. Michael and Roxana had conspired to wipe out her entire family. Roxana was to kill them one by one, her brother, her sister, and finally her parents. Chillingly, text messages from the night before revealed Roxana had second thoughts. She loved her siblings, they were her blood. She loved her adoptive parents too. But Michael's manipulation was relentless. He pressured her, gaslight her fears, told her it was the only way they could be together. Under his influence, Roxana picked up the knife and did the unthinkable. Given her age, there was a fierce debate about whether she should be tried as a juvenile or an adult. The prosecution argued that the brutality of the crime warranted adult charges, and the judge agreed. Roxana was sent to a juvenile facility, but soon after, transferred to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. Her parents, Lorraine and Jeffrey, never stopped fighting for her. They pleaded for leniency, insisting their daughter had been brainwashed, emotionally broken by Michael's manipulation. They believed she had acted out of desperation and illness, not malice. They spent $30,000 on a top lawyer to help her, fighting to keep her out of prison. But despite their efforts, the legal system moved fast. When Roxana was later assigned a public defender, she was advised to accept a plea deal. Without her parents' knowledge, Roxana agreed, pleading guilty to assault with intent to murder. She was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 2024. Her parents were devastated. They believed the deal was a betrayal, that their daughter had been thrown away, her vulnerability ignored. Lorraine, 54, spoke out in anguish. She feared for her daughter's mental health in adult prison, knowing Roxana's fragile state could only worsen behind bars. She questioned how justice was truly being served, asking, how can locking her away fix what's broken? They accused the public defender of negligence, believing he had no real interest in fighting for Roxana's future. Had they been informed of the plea deal, they would have fought it tooth and nail. Her father, Jeffrey, 50, was equally broken, filled with rage and sorrow over the way the trial unfolded. Their fears grew even more when Roxana began threatening self-harm from behind bars. They blamed the police, too, for failing to arrest Michael the first time they caught him with Roxana, when they had a chance to prevent all of this. Meanwhile, during his own trial, Michael tried to spin the narrative, blaming Roxana entirely. He painted himself as a bystander, claiming it was her idea, her plan, and that he was simply a shoulder to lean on. But the evidence told a very different story. The text messages between them revealed a calculated and sinister truth: Michael had orchestrated every step. He had manipulated, pressured, and directed Roxana toward destruction. In the end, it was not just a family that was torn apart, but a girl's life, twisted beyond recognition by someone she trusted. The story of Roxana and Michael remains a tragic reminder of how manipulation, desperation, and blind love can lead to unimaginable horror. And for Roxana's parents, the nightmare is far from over. After a long and grueling trial, Michelangelo Rivera was ultimately found guilty. The courtroom, heavy with tension, fell into a hushed silence as the judge delivered the crushing sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the families impacted, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind would take far longer to heal. In a desperate bid to change her fate, Roxana, once the bright, lively spirit now shadowed by regret, withdrew her guilty plea. She turned against her own defense attorney, accusing him of mishandling her case, and begged the court for a new trial. But the legal system is not easily swayed by last-minute pleas. Her request was swiftly denied. Today, Roxana remains behind the somber walls of Hiram Valley Women's Correctional Colony, serving out her sentence, counting the days, hoping, perhaps foolishly, for a redemption that may never come. The real tragedy, however, extended far beyond courtrooms and prison walls. Roxana's siblings, innocent bystanders in this grim chapter, were left deeply wounded. The attack shattered their sense of safety and peace. Haunted by relentless nightmares, they couldn't even bring themselves to sleep in their own bedrooms. The laughter and warmth that once filled their home were replaced with silence, fear, and endless nights of tearful waking. Thankfully, time, along with love and extensive rehabilitation, began to work its healing magic. Slowly, the children started reclaiming fragments of their childhood. Their mother shared a hopeful update: the family's life was, piece by fragile piece, returning to something resembling normalcy. In an incredible act of forgiveness and resilience, they even began to look forward to the possibility of Roxana returning home one day. Today's story is one that will grip your heart and chill your bones: the heartbreaking case of Lee Matthews. Born in 1983, Lee Matthews was the cherished daughter of Rob and Sharon Matthews. Rob, a well-respected businessman and IT director in South Africa, had built a successful career with the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, one of the most powerful financial institutions on the continent. Lee shared an especially close bond with her mother. Together, they would often lose themselves in hours of shopping, gym sessions, and creating beautiful scrapbooks, handmade albums filled with memories, now painfully bittersweet reminders of what was lost. Known for her tender heart, Lee volunteered at animal welfare organizations and rallied to send aid to victims after the tragic Columbine massacre, displaying a kindness rare even among her peers. Quiet, modest, and often blushing at the slightest compliment, Lee's world was filled with dreams of building a life in finance, following in her father's successful footsteps. But everything changed in the blink of an eye. July 8, 2004, Lee celebrated her 21st birthday with friends and family at a local restaurant. The night was filled with joy and laughter, ending with the whole restaurant singing "Happy Birthday" to her. Embarrassed yet beaming, Lee couldn't have known that this would be the last time she'd feel safe. The next morning, she attended classes at her university, but she never made it home. At noon, Rob Matthews' phone rang. It was Lee's number, but not Lee's voice. Instead, a stranger spoke, calm, cold, calculated. He claimed he had Lee. He demanded 350,000 South African rand, around $20,000, for her safe return, warning Rob not to involve the police. His voice carried a slight local accent. He spoke like someone used to getting what he wanted. Then, in a moment that must have shattered Rob's heart, the kidnapper handed the phone to Lee. Sobbing, terrified, she pleaded with her father. "Daddy, please, please do what they say." The call cut out abruptly. In a state of panic, Rob and Sharon chose to comply. They gathered the ransom and waited at the designated drop-off point. But Lee's phone went dead, voicemail after voicemail, with no reply. The helplessness was unbearable. Finally, they called the police. An elite investigative team was assembled. Experts in cell tracking, negotiators seasoned in kidnap-for-ransom cases, and local detectives all threw themselves into the race against time. Lee's photo was splashed across newspapers and television screens: blue jeans, a red top, a black leather jacket. Her mother Sharon made a tearful public appeal, begging the kidnapper to show mercy, to let Lee come home, to let her finish the life she had just begun. The search effort was massive. Friends, strangers, classmates, everyone searched parks, back alleys, abandoned fields. A reward was offered. Websites were launched. Leads trickled in, but none brought them closer to Lee. In a final act of desperation, Sharon even consulted a psychic. The woman claimed to see visions of Lee's location. For a brief moment, there was hope. But the psychic's visions faded just as quickly, leaving everyone more lost and broken than before. Authorities warned that in South Africa, kidnappings like this weren't rare. They happened almost once a month, calculated, emotionless crimes treating human lives like commodities. Often, these cases resembled grim business deals, with abductors treating victims and their families as transactions. But this case felt different. This felt personal. As days turned into agonizing weeks, Rob and Sharon fought against despair. Hope is a cruel thing, it lifts you up, only to smash you down when reality sets in. And somewhere out there, the clock was ticking. At first, it seemed like so many other kidnappings, terrifying, yes, but with a glimmer of hope. Most victims, after about 3 tense and unbearable weeks, were returned safely to their families once ransom payments were made. That's what everyone prayed would happen for 21-year-old Lee Matthews. From the beginning, investigators suspected that Lee's abduction wasn't random. It was coldly calculated. The kidnapper had stalked her for days, maybe even weeks, following her movements, learning her patterns, and waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. The Matthews family clung to hope, desperate and determined to believe that Lee would come home. They trusted that the kidnapper would soon make contact, demand a ransom, and that this nightmare would eventually end with Lee back in their arms. But fate had a crueler plan. On the morning of July 21, 2004, a street sweeper working in Grasmere Square stumbled across a horrifying sight. Lying lifeless on the cold ground was the naked body of a young girl. Without hesitation, he called the police. Within hours, authorities confirmed everyone's worst fear: the victim was Lee Matthews. She had been shot 3 times. Her body was bound. The scene was brutal, raw, and it shattered whatever faint hopes remained. Over 50 officers, including forensic experts, descended upon the area, sealing it off and combing every inch for evidence. The medical examiner's report painted a chilling picture. Lee had been killed 4 to 5 days before her body was discovered. Shockingly, this was a week after her family had paid part of the ransom. This grim timeline immediately led to frenzied speculation. Was Lee murdered because her family couldn't deliver the full ransom amount? Was it all for nothing? The police, however, were quick to quash these rumors. They focused instead on gathering real evidence, launching an intense manhunt for Lee's killer. South Africa watched, waited, and mourned together. Investigators meticulously pieced together a timeline from over 100 interviews and leads. Their work led to a shocking new theory: Lee's body had been frozen after death. The uneven decomposition of her remains suggested she had been stored, perhaps in a large container of ice, before being dumped in the square. The killer, it seemed, had staged the discovery to mislead police, buying himself time to vanish. The crime was now clear: this wasn't just a botched ransom. It was a cold-blooded murder, executed with chilling precision. For months, the case seemed to stall, until early October, when a major breakthrough finally came. A 24-year-old university student named Donovan Moodley was arrested. Moodley was no stranger to Lee. He attended the same university. And chillingly, before his arrest, he had confessed the crime to several friends, one of whom eventually tipped off the police. Moodley's fingerprint was found on the tape used to bind Lee. Phone records placed him moving alongside Lee's phone after the abduction. It was undeniable. As more details emerged, the true horror of what happened to Lee became clear. At first, it had been reported that the Matthews family delayed contacting the police. In truth, they had acted immediately. The police had even accompanied Lee's father to the ransom exchange. But in a last-minute move, the kidnapper, spooked by the heavy police presence, abandoned the plan, leaving the ransom and fleeing into the shadows. In July 2005, just before his trial was set to begin at the Johannesburg High Court, Donovan Moodley pled guilty to 3 charges related to Lee's kidnapping and murder. His lawyer read aloud the cold, clinical statements that Moodley had prepared, statements that made the courtroom shudder. Moodley admitted he never specifically targeted Lee. She was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been lurking around the university, hunting for a wealthy-looking victim. His motive? Pure greed. On the night of the abduction, he approached Lee in the university parking lot, asking her for a ride. Once she agreed, he pulled out a gun, forced her to lie on the floor of his car, bound her hands and feet, gagged her with tape, and covered her head with a balaclava. In the hours and days that followed, Donovan Moodley wrestled with fear of getting caught, fear of the police checkpoints, fear of the consequences if he let Lee go. Ultimately, he made the most horrifying decision. Moodley drove Lee to a remote spot, forced her to strip naked, stripping her of not just clothing but dignity, and then shot her in the back of the head. To be sure, he fired 3 more shots using specialized bullets designed to explode on impact, inflicting maximum damage. And then, with blood on his hands and ice in his veins, he simply carried on with his life. After killing Lee, Moodley proposed to his girlfriend, gave her a ring, and even played in a volleyball tournament, all while the nation wept for a missing girl he knew was already dead. When Moodley stood in court, he described his own actions as disgusting. He admitted that he had kept Lee captive for several days before murdering her. But prosecutors weren't satisfied with his partial confession. They accused him of hiding deeper, darker truths. Forensic evidence suggested that Lee wasn't killed where her body was found. Instead, her body had been kept frozen for days before being dumped, a crucial fact that contradicted Donovan's account. Authorities also believed that he hadn't acted alone. Yet to this day, Moodley has never revealed if he had accomplices or where he had held Lee captive. The brutal murder of Lee Matthews remains one of South Africa's most haunting crimes, a story of betrayal, cruelty, and a life stolen far too soon. And while Donovan Moodley sits behind bars, many believe the full truth of what happened to Lee Matthews still remains buried. The chilling state of Lee Matthews' body told a story, a haunting one. Forensic experts observed that the condition of her fingers and toes suggested she had been in prolonged contact with extremely cold surfaces, possibly the inside of a refrigerator or freezer. There were also disturbing tissue marks across her body, marks that hinted she had been wrapped tightly in a blanket, her body hidden away as if to erase the crime. Rigor mortis had set in, but something was off. The stiffness and temperature of her remains suggested she had been kept cool deliberately. More horrifying, when an autopsy was performed, it revealed that only 400 milliliters of blood remained in her body, a fraction of what should have been there. This stark detail painted a grim picture. Lee had not only been murdered, but her blood had been drained elsewhere, far from where her body was eventually found. There were no signs of blood at the discovery site, another piece of the terrible puzzle. Adding to the horror, investigators found no maggots or insect activity on Lee's body, a grim sign that it hadn't been exposed to the environment for long. She had likely been frozen after her death to delay decomposition. As detectives dug deeper, suspicion tightened around Donovan Moodley. Cell phone records placed him near the crime scene, his call logs betrayed him. His phone was traced to the vicinity shortly after Lee disappeared. And when police caught up with him, they found more damning evidence, a 9mm pistol in his possession, the very same caliber weapon used in Lee's murder. During the trial, emotions ran high. Lee's father took the stand, his voice thick with grief and fury. He called Donovan a manipulative coward, someone unworthy of the life he had so callously destroyed. What shook the courtroom most was his observation: Donovan had gone on with his life after the murder, as if nothing had happened, a chilling testament to his ruthlessness. Throughout the trial, Donovan sat emotionless, a cold statue, until the day his own father, Stephen Moodley, was called to testify. Stephen spoke of a son he once admired, a boy who had brought pride to the family with job promotions and steady achievements. But that pride turned to shame the moment he learned what Donovan had done. Stephen admitted he was bewildered. Donovan had never needed money. The family was financially stable. So why? Why commit such an unspeakable act? Fighting back tears, Stephen offered an apology to the Lee family, acknowledging the unbearable weight his family now had to carry. "He is our son," Stephen said, voice breaking, "and he will always be our son. But we cannot undo this." His words finally cracked Donovan's facade. For the first time, Donovan wept. The tragedy traced back even further. Donovan's life had been marked by dark events. In 2001, his grandfather was stabbed to death, by Donovan's own uncle. The uncle was declared mentally unfit and sent to a psychiatric hospital instead of prison, leaving deep emotional scars within the family. During Donovan's trial, prosecutors sought the harshest sentence possible, life behind bars. His defense team tried to paint him as remorseful, claiming he hadn't intended to kill. They insisted he pled guilty only because the evidence against him was insurmountable. But the judge saw through the facade. Calling Donovan's crime exceptionally brutal, the judge handed down one of the most severe sentences in South African legal history, life for murder, 25 years, plus 15 years for kidnapping, and 10 more for extortion. Even after the gavel fell, the case didn't rest. Investigators suspected Donovan hadn't acted alone. Too many pieces didn't fit neatly. There were whispers of accomplices, and loose ends that demanded further inquiry. Refusing to fade quietly into prison life, Donovan launched a series of appeals. He claimed he had been framed. In October 2009, he filed documents with the Supreme Court of Appeal, arguing that media bias had poisoned his trial and that he hadn't intended to kill Lee. His appeals painted the original trial as a miscarriage of justice, insisting that the life sentence was shockingly inappropriate. When those appeals failed, Donovan changed his story dramatically. In a 2011 appeal, he alleged that 3 drug dealers, Frank and Jumbo, had forced him into the crime by threatening his family. He claimed Lee wasn't the original target. Instead, when she appeared in the university parking lot, the plan changed. Donovan said he was merely the driver, forced to watch as I grabbed Lee. He described how they used Lee's phone to demand ransom from her family, and later, how he was powerless to stop Jumbo from pulling the trigger. Donovan claimed he was forced to help dispose of Lee's car, and to tamper with the body, explaining the forensic evidence that linked him so tightly to the crime. Terrified, confused, and isolated, he said he was too afraid to report the true killers. He even accused the investigators of fabricating evidence and turning the media into a weapon against him. Yet despite his evolving narratives, despite blaming phantom drug dealers, Donovan ultimately confessed, once again, to the murder during his final appeal. His bizarre behavior reached its peak when he compared himself to Jesus Christ, portraying himself as a victim of betrayal and injustice. But the courts weren't swayed. One after another, every appeal was rejected. Donovan Moodley would spend his life behind bars. The brutal kidnapping and murder of Lee Matthews didn't just end a beautiful young life, it left a permanent scar across the nation's heart. Her memory, and the horrors she endured, would never be forgotten. Over in South Africa, the trial of Donovan did little to ease the agony of Lee's parents. As the trial unfolded, Lee's mother bravely spoke out, revealing how Donovan's actions had shattered their lives. Every night, before she and her husband went to bed, they would visit Lee's room, still hoping, praying, that she would be there, safe, smiling, and free from harm. But the painful truth was that their daughter was gone, and the damage done by Donovan was irreversible. Now, crime enthusiasts, brace yourselves for another unsettling tale. This time, it's the chilling story of Brianna Nugent. Born and raised in Hayden, Alabama, Brianna was known for her bright personality and her ability to make friends easily. She had little interest in boys during her high school years, instead choosing to pour her energy into her studies with a single goal in mind, to become a nurse. After graduating, she took the next step, enrolling in the nursing program at Wallace Community College, where her path would soon cross with Stephen Nix. Stephen was the polar opposite of Brianna. He was carefree, irresponsible, and unconcerned about his future. Known for his drinking and gambling habits, he worked as a cleaner at the local medical center, the same place Brianna was interning. His lack of ambition clashed with Brianna's disciplined nature, yet somehow, they became romantically involved. Despite their differences, Brianna eventually moved in with Stephen, who lived with his parents. But things began to unravel when Stephen confessed to an affair with a coworker. The revelation devastated Brianna, leading her to end the relationship. She focused on her studies and soon earned her nursing degree. But Stephen wasn't done. He begged Brianna for another chance, swearing that he would never cheat again. After months of persistence, Brianna relented, and they rekindled their relationship. The two eventually married and began working toward buying their first home. However, trouble soon followed when Stephen lost his job as a cleaner. He struggled to find another job, and eventually, he gave up. His routine became increasingly unhealthy, playing video games all night and sleeping through the day. Despite Brianna's steady income as a nurse, Stephen's refusal to contribute financially led to tension. He began controlling the household budget, forcing Brianna to beg him for money even for the essentials, including food. But Stephen's financial irresponsibility didn't end there. His spending spiraled out of control, racking up a debt of nearly $50,000. In a desperate attempt to fix things, Stephen convinced Brianna to declare bankruptcy. It was clear that he had an unhealthy grip on her, and Brianna, feeling emotionally drained, had no choice but to comply. The bankruptcy wiped out their debts, but it took a heavy toll on her mentally and emotionally, leaving her depressed and relying on expensive medication to cope. In 2019, Brianna's work offered her a life insurance policy, something that would protect her if anything were to happen to her, something Stephen had reluctantly agreed was a good idea. By February 2020, Stephen was still unemployed and increasingly reliant on Brianna for support. She started suspecting he might betray her again and feared he might be using drugs. In response, Brianna hid her medication, but Stephen continued to control her finances and her life. She felt trapped in a toxic relationship and began planning her escape. She confided only in a few close friends and her sister, expressing her intention to file for divorce. Then, on March 2, 2020, disaster struck. Around noon, Stephen called 911, claiming that he had found Brianna unresponsive in their bathroom. However, during the call, Stephen showed little to no urgency or concern for his wife. He didn't follow the dispatcher's instructions to perform CPR, instead focusing solely on telling his version of the story. When paramedics arrived, they found that something was wrong. A sheriff's deputy had arrived before them, odd, given that he was supposed to be half an hour away, and even more peculiar was that Stephen's family was already at the scene, despite living far away. Brianna's relatives arrived soon after, and the medics tried in vain to revive her, but it was too late. Brianna was already cold, indicating she had been dead for several hours before anyone found her. A syringe with an 18mm needle was discovered nearby, raising suspicions that Brianna may have died from an overdose of illegal drugs. Stephen, however, insisted that Brianna had been dead for some time when he found her. He claimed that he was preparing to go outside when he heard a loud noise from the bathroom, which he dismissed as something falling, perhaps a phone. When he returned an hour later, he discovered her lifeless body. Brianna's family rejected the idea that she had died from an overdose. They spoke often with her, and there were no signs that she had ever struggled with substance abuse. As a nurse, Brianna was subject to random drug and alcohol screenings at work, all of which came back negative. Her colleagues could not fathom her using any kind of harmful substance. When Brianna's relatives arrived, they noticed something chilling. Stephen appeared disturbingly calm. Instead of showing the grief expected from someone who had just lost his wife, he seemed almost detached, even cleaning the house in the aftermath of the tragedy. The calm demeanor, combined with the strange circumstances surrounding her death, raised a red flag. Brianna's family knew something didn't add up, and they were determined to get to the truth. As this case unfolds, the question remains, was it a tragic accident, or is there something far darker lurking beneath the surface? Stay tuned as we continue to unravel this mystery in our next chilling investigation. At first, Stephen's behavior seemed normal, maybe a little shaken, but nothing out of the ordinary given the tragedy that had just unfolded. However, that calm exterior cracked the moment the police showed up at the house. His demeanor shifted dramatically. He grew anxious, jittery, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. As the officers began their careful examination of the crime scene, Stephen made a suspicious move. Instead of tossing a full bag of collected bathroom trash into the bin like anyone would, he quietly hauled it over to his pickup truck and threw it inside, as if hiding something he didn't want the police to find. The investigation into Brianna's death had barely started when red flags began to appear. When police requested access to Brianna's mobile phone, Stephen flat out refused. It was only thanks to Brianna's sister, Brittany, that they gained access, and what she found was chilling. Brianna's call logs showed that Stephen had called her at 7:53 a.m., an odd time for him, considering he was usually still asleep after long, late-night gaming sessions. When asked about the call, Stephen brushed it off, saying he had only called to tease her. But he couldn't, or wouldn't, explain the nature of this so-called joke. The inconsistencies kept piling up. After calling 911, Stephen inexplicably sent Brianna a text message at 12:02 p.m., despite knowing she was already dead. When questioned about it, he offered no clear explanation, only further deepening the suspicions around him. Things escalated when police wanted to search Stephen's car. He refused. Realizing he had suspiciously disposed of a garbage bag, investigators had no choice but to return to the station to obtain a warrant, a crucial delay that Stephen used to his advantage. During that window of time, he got rid of the trash and likely any vital evidence along with it. By the time Brianna's family arrived the next day to gather her belongings for her burial, the house had been thoroughly cleaned. Too thoroughly. Brittany immediately noticed something strange. Brianna didn't even own basic, nice underwear. For someone who worked hard and cared about appearances, this was deeply odd. It spoke volumes about the control Stephen had over Brianna. She wasn't even allowed to spend money on herself. The next day, in a move that felt more like manipulation than mourning, Stephen called Brittany over to the house to talk. When she arrived, Stephen's relatives were already there. He produced 2 empty bottles of opioid painkillers and a bag of syringes, claiming he had found them hidden among Brianna's things, implying she had a secret drug addiction that ultimately led to her death. But Brittany wasn't buying it. For one, the medication required prescriptions that Brianna, a trained nurse, would never have accessed in that way. Second, Brittany and her mother had just gone through all of Brianna's belongings. They would have noticed if anything like that had been there. Stephen then showed Brittany a drawer he claimed to have overlooked previously, filled with Brianna's underwear and more evidence. It felt staged. Brittany's gut told her something was terribly wrong, and that Stephen might have had a direct hand in Brianna's death. That grim suspicion turned into near certainty when Brittany went to the funeral home to style Brianna's hair and makeup. Stephen's family had strongly objected to Brittany seeing the body, and when she arrived, it was clear why. Brianna's body was covered in dozens of fresh bruises and over 80 injection marks, some fresh, others in various stages of healing. This wasn't the body of someone who had died peacefully in her sleep. This was a body that had fought and suffered. As a certified nurse, Brianna knew how to properly administer injections. Even if she had secretly struggled with addiction, which her family firmly denied, the placement of some needle marks, in places she couldn't have reached herself, made it clear, someone else had restrained her and injected her. There were also signs of trauma on her palms, consistent with defensive wounds. Experts would later estimate that the injuries were inflicted 8 to 12 hours before her death. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't suicide. It was a crime. And yet, it felt as though the system had already decided not to fight for Brianna. Brittany managed to quietly snap several photos of her sister's injuries before being forced to leave the funeral home. These photos would later become critical evidence, heartbreaking proof that Brianna hadn't simply overdosed, but had died a violent, tragic death. Meanwhile, Stephen's behavior only grew more grotesque. At Brianna's funeral, he barely spoke to anyone, offering no comfort to grieving family and friends. He tried, poorly, to fake tears, but it was obvious to everyone that the emotion wasn't real. Witnesses even reported hearing Stephen brag about connections that could help him dodge any legal trouble. In a chilling twist, it was later discovered that the first deputy sheriff on the scene, the one who arrived before anyone else, was related to Stephen. Yet, somehow, this deputy was never officially recorded as part of the investigation. By October 2020, an investigator privately told Brianna's family that she had indeed been the victim of a crime. The theory floated was that Brianna had witnessed another crime, and was killed to silence her. But that theory was never officially confirmed. The case was closed. Labeled an accidental death. Just like that. And Stephen? He wasted no time moving on. Within days of Brianna's death, his long-term mistress had moved into the house they once shared. Together, they renamed Brianna's beloved dogs, erasing her memory piece by piece. Stephen collected the $160,000 life insurance payout and spent it like a child left home alone with a credit card. On video games. On pouring concrete in front of the house. On expensive car parts. On weapons. On luxury gifts for his lover, including extravagant jewelry and even ostrich leather boots. It took 6 months, and relentless pressure from Brianna's family, before Stephen finally bought a tombstone for the woman he had once vowed to love and protect. Even then, it felt more like a begrudging obligation than an act of love or grief. Through it all, Brianna's family never stopped fighting for her. They filed complaints, called authorities, pushed for answers. But doors kept slamming shut. Justice, it seemed, wasn't interested in Brianna. The case remains a haunting testament to a system that failed a young woman who deserved better, and a chilling reminder that sometimes, the people closest to us are the ones we should fear the most. Hello, crime enthusiasts, welcome back to another chilling dive into the shadows where secrets live and tragedy breathes. Today, we're unraveling a case that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about trust, love, and betrayal. Let's begin with the devastating case of Joe and Menchie. In the courtroom, the prosecutor made a bold move, revealing secret audio recordings between the couple. These tapes exposed the hidden realities of their strained relationship, peeling back the carefully maintained facade to reveal an unsettling truth. Through these recordings, the motive behind the horrific crime began to come into sharper focus. Despite every effort, investigators never found any evidence suggesting that Menchie was involved with other men, a fact that added another layer of complexity to the case. On November 11, 2021, after nearly 7 grueling hours of tense deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict. They found Joe guilty of second-degree murder. The weight of their decision fell heavy. Joe was sentenced to 28 years in prison, nearly 3 decades behind bars. Today, Joe and Menchie's young daughter lives with Joe's mother. Yet, the story doesn't end there. Menchie's grieving parents are now fighting for joint custody of their 4-year-old granddaughter. Joe's defense attorney argues fiercely that while the child will always have a bond with her Chinese grandparents, Joe's mother is the safest guardian for her now. Another broken family. Another innocent child caught in the crossfire. But we're just getting started. Let's journey further back in time, to a case that still haunts the quiet suburbs of Brighton, New York. This is the tragic story of Kathy Krasnak. February 19, 1982, a day etched into the memories of everyone who lived on that sleepy street. Police were called to the Krasnak family home, and what they found was something straight out of a nightmare. There, lying lifeless, was 29-year-old Kathy Krasnak, an axe cruelly embedded in her head, a single, fatal blow. Earlier that day, Kathy's husband, 30-year-old James Krasnak, had fled to a neighbor's house, carrying their 3-year-old daughter in his blood-soaked arms. He was crying, trembling, almost incoherent, as he gasped that something terrible had happened. According to James, he had left for work early that morning at Kodak, where he worked as an economist. He claimed Kathy and their daughter Sarah were still sleeping when he left. But when he returned around 5 p.m., something felt wrong immediately. The garage door was wide open. The kitchen window shattered. The glass door between the garage and house splintered. Inside, he found Kathy, lifeless, sprawled on the bed, and their daughter, unharmed but confused, nearby. In a desperate move to protect Sarah, James raced to a neighbor's home and begged for help. Little Sarah, too young to grasp the horror, gave police a haunting detail. she remembered seeing a multicolored bad guy on her parents' bed and blood on her mother's face. A child's mind trying to piece together something no child should ever see. Yet even amidst the grief, investigators noticed troubling details. The axe, taken from the family's own garage, had been wiped clean of fingerprints. Inside the house, no fingerprints at all, not even the usual smudges you'd expect in a home lived in by a family. It was as if someone had sterilized the crime scene. And there was more. A damp bathroom rug was found drying in the garage, but James claimed he had no idea how it got there. No signs of forced theft, either. Kathy's purse had been emptied onto the floor, but nothing was missing, not the money, not the jewelry, not the expensive tea sets. Cash left in plain sight remained untouched. This wasn't the sloppy panic of a robbery gone wrong. This was something else. Seasoned officers, veterans of countless theft investigations, immediately knew. This scene was staged. This was personal. Naturally, suspicion fell heavily on James, the grieving husband. Those closest to them described James and Kathy as a picture-perfect couple, high school sweethearts who married after college, moved states together, built careers, and raised a daughter. Kathy, born into a family of truck drivers, was warm and nurturing. James, the son of successful business owners, was ambitious, driven. After settling in Brighton in 1981, they seemed destined for a peaceful life. But friends began whispering about changes in Kathy. In the 6 months leading up to her death, they noticed something different. Irritability. Restlessness. An undercurrent of fear that she never spoke aloud. Was Kathy hiding something? Was James not the man he appeared to be? Or had an outside force invaded their home, and destroyed their family? The truth, as always, is hidden in the details. And it is these details that we will continue to uncover as we peel back the layers of a case that has haunted a community, and left 1,000 questions unanswered. Stay tuned, crime seekers, because the darkness is only beginning to unfold. Tonight, we're diving deep into a heart-wrenching case filled with tragedy, unanswered questions, and an unrelenting search for justice. This is the story of Brianna, a young woman whose death left a family shattered, and whose truth is still being fought for. After Brianna's sudden death, her family knew something wasn't right. Their instincts told them there was more to the story. Refusing to stay silent, they appealed to higher authorities again and again, desperately urging the police to reopen the investigation. Each time, they were met with cold bureaucracy. They were told it was no longer in the jurisdiction of the original police station. But Brianna's family couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was standing in their way. They began to suspect that Stephen, Brianna's husband, was using his personal connections to obstruct the investigation. Despite the walls closing in around them, Brianna's sister, Brittany, stayed determined. She refused to let her sister's story end in silence. After tireless pressure, the case was eventually reopened. But what they found chilled them to their core. All the evidence had mysteriously disappeared. No thorough examinations had ever been conducted. Key documents were missing. Critical pieces of Brianna's story had been erased, almost like someone wanted the truth buried. Stephen, meanwhile, continued to stonewall the family. He refused to share crucial information, especially regarding Brianna's autopsy and toxicology reports. He claimed legal restrictions kept him from sharing the pathologist's findings, yet somehow, he already knew the details inside and out. His strange behavior raised unsettling questions. What exactly was he hiding, and why? Knowing they couldn't rely on law enforcement alone, Brianna's family took matters into their own hands. They hired a private investigator. What he uncovered would crack the case wide open. Among the findings was disturbing video footage, evidence taken from a search of Stephen's car and home. In the footage, Stephen was seen grinning, leaning casually over Brianna's lifeless body. There was no sadness. No fear. Just a cold, chilling smile. Once the footage became public knowledge, Stephen's demeanor changed. Suddenly fearful, he scrambled to install security cameras around his property, as if he knew the walls were closing in. Meanwhile, Brittany pressed on. She unearthed another damning piece of evidence, a photograph of a fentanyl package allegedly found in Brianna's possession. Skeptical, Brittany sent the photo to Brianna's co-workers at the hospital. Their response was swift and damning. They had never seen such a drug package before. The hospital used a completely different supplier, with completely different packaging. Stevens claimed that Brianna had become addicted to work-sourced drugs was unraveling fast. An official inquiry from the hospital later confirmed it. Brianna couldn't have stolen the drugs. All their medication records were tightly monitored. And the oversized needles found in Brianna's home? Those weren't the type used for administering fentanyl. Brianna, a trained nurse, would have known that better than anyone. For long months after Brianna's death, the family finally received the toxicology report. It painted a horrifying picture. Brianna's body contained extremely high levels of psychotropic drugs, including antidepressants and fentanyl, almost double the lethal dose. Given her medical expertise, it seemed unthinkable that Brianna would have accidentally overdosed. The evidence suggested something far more sinister. When Brittany later spoke to the medical examiner who conducted Brianna's autopsy, he admitted something shocking. His conclusions were heavily influenced by reports from external agencies like the sheriff's office and coroner's office, not purely the medical findings. The official death certificate listed Brianna's cause of death as an accidental overdose. But with so many irregularities, the truth seemed increasingly distant. Still, the family refused to give up. They launched a petition, hoping to raise public awareness and cover mounting legal costs. But the world, sadly, was slow to respond. They raised only $5,000, a fraction of the $20,000 they needed. The financial burden fell squarely on Brianna's grieving family. Then came the funeral, a final insult to injury. Stephen stood by Brianna's casket, saying nothing. He did not deliver a eulogy. He shed no tears. He showed no regret, no sadness, only a chilling, detached indifference. Brianna's family noticed it immediately. 6 months earlier, Stephen had mourned the death of a friend for an entire week, crying, grieving, unable to function. Yet the death of his wife, the woman he had vowed to love and cherish, barely seemed to register. It's details like these that haunt the case, even years later. The story of Brianna is one of injustice, heartbreak, and a family's unbreakable will to uncover the truth. Despite every obstacle thrown their way, Brittany and her family continue to fight, because they believe that one day, the world will see Brianna not as a statistic, but as a human being who deserved better. And now, detectives, it's up to us, to remember Brianna's name and demand the justice she so rightly deserves. She had been feeling restless for days, itching for a break from the monotony. So when the opportunity came up to join her friends at a popular party at the Lauren Canada nightclub, Natalia didn't hesitate. The night was vibrant, music thumping through the walls, laughter echoing across the dance floor, and the girls stayed until nearly 5 a.m., caught up in the electric energy of it all. As the first hints of dawn crept into the sky, they decided it was finally time to leave. While her friends headed toward the exit, Natalia stayed behind for a moment, caught up in conversation with a man named Leonardo Roccavan, an old acquaintance who owned a local bookstore. They stood near the exit, deep in discussion, oblivious to the world around them. Natalia's friends, tired and ready to crash, waited for her outside by the car they had all arrived in. Minutes passed. One of the girls, growing impatient, went back inside to fetch her, but by the time she returned to the club, both Natalia and Leonardo had vanished. Confused and uneasy, the girls searched the crowded club. It didn't make sense. Natalia wasn't the type to just leave without a word. Especially not after a night out together. They wandered to the second floor, hoping to catch sight of her, and that's when they noticed Leonardo's BMW still parked outside. Through the car's darkly tinted windows, they couldn't see clearly, but they noticed some faint movement inside. They knocked on the window, calling out for Leonardo. He rolled it down slightly and casually said he was just sitting there with a friend. When they asked about Natalia, he brushed it off, claimed they had chatted briefly, said their goodbyes, and that he hadn't seen her since. Still uneasy, but unsure what else to do, the girls reluctantly assumed Natalia had found another ride home. They decided to leave, driving over to a nearby relative's house to check if maybe she had gone there instead. They honked outside, trying not to wake the whole household, but when no one answered, a pit grew heavier in their stomachs. They rushed back to the club, desperate, searching every corner, calling her name into the empty morning air. 2 hours passed, with no sign of Natalia. As the sun rose higher, Silva, exhausted and scared, finally went home. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. She confided in her parents, and although they tried to calm her fears, she knew deep down that her friend wouldn't have simply disappeared. At 11 a.m., after a restless sleep, Silva awoke with an even heavier heart. Natalia's family was now involved, and a full-scale search began. Friends and family returned to the club, desperate for answers, but found only locked doors and silence. No one around had seen or heard anything. By 5 p.m., the police were officially involved. At the Maldonado Police Department, Natalia's family handed over photos from the night of the party, images of the girls smiling, drinks in hand, frozen moments from hours before everything changed. The police used the photos to piece together a description of what Natalia was wearing that night. Initially, the authorities floated a familiar, dismissive theory: maybe she had been drinking heavily, gotten into a stranger's car, made a reckless choice. But Rosalia and Silva were adamant, Natalia hadn't touched alcohol that night. Nor drugs. They insisted their friend was sober and responsible, and her disappearance was something far more sinister. The investigation focused on the last place she was seen, the Lauren Canada nightclub. Unfortunately, there were no surveillance cameras, no footage to rewind and scour for clues. Interviews with club staff turned up an unsettling detail: a group of 3 young men, seated at a table nearby, had been harassing the girls throughout the evening. Despite this, police attention zeroed in on Leonardo Roccavan, the last person known to have spoken to Natalia. To some, he seemed an unlikely suspect, a quiet, well-mannered young businessman, owner of a modest bookstore. Friends and acquaintances vouched for his good nature. That night, Leonardo's girlfriend had been waiting for him in his car while he spoke with Natalia. According to Leonardo, after their conversation ended, he rejoined his girlfriend in the car and saw Natalia step outside onto the porch, and that was the last he claimed to have seen her. He said there were no screams, no commotion, nothing to suggest trouble. And yet, suspicion stuck to him like glue. The police weren't buying his story. They obtained a search warrant for his BMW, a sleek vehicle that several witnesses later reported seeing near secluded parts of the city, including, disturbingly, a dense forest and a quiet lake. One witness reported seeing a couple inside a car matching Leonardo's that night, near the woods. He thought they were just lovers seeking privacy, but in hindsight, maybe it was something far more sinister. The car inspection turned up a single long, dark hair on the floor. Tension mounted, but when forensic tests came back, it wasn't a match for Natalia. It belonged to someone else. There were no signs of violence in the car, no blood, no torn clothing, no fingerprints smeared in panic. It was almost too clean, suspiciously clean. Investigators speculated that Leonardo might have cleaned the car thoroughly after Natalia vanished. The lack of evidence frustrated everyone. Leonardo couldn't be arrested, not yet. There were too many unanswered questions. Too many loose threads. And as the clock ticked on, one chilling truth settled over the town like a heavy fog. Natalia Martinez was missing. And somewhere out there, the answers, and maybe Natalia herself, were waiting to be found. It was a chilly morning on the outskirts of Puss when a passerby, driving down a lonely stretch of road, noticed something unusual scattered along the roadside. Curiosity got the better of him, and when he pulled over, he found a woman's handbag, a wallet, and a pair of women's shoes abandoned in the dirt. But it was what he found next that chilled him to the bone, a crucial clue tied directly to one of the most talked about cases in the country, the disappearance of Natalia Martinez. Realizing the gravity of his discovery, the passerby didn't hesitate. He immediately contacted the police, setting into motion a series of events that would only deepen the mystery and, tragically, lead to even more heartbreak. At the time, Natalia's case was already a media frenzy. Every headline, every news channel seemed to echo her name, but with the attention came a flood of dark, unverified rumors. Whispers began circulating, ugly claims that Natalia had ties to drug dealers, that she had somehow gotten entangled in dangerous criminal activities. Her family, already shattered by her disappearance, had to endure the additional agony of defending her honor. Her father, Ever Martinez, stood tall and defiant in front of television cameras, forcefully denying these accusations. But no matter how loudly he spoke, the rumors only grew. The police, who desperately needed the media's help to find Natalia, instead found themselves drowning in false testimonies and wild conspiracy theories. Every day, more tips poured in, claims that Natalia had been attacked, kidnapped, even murdered, each one needing to be investigated, each one dragging the investigation further into chaos. News outlets, eager for readers and ratings, didn't care for the truth. They splashed the most sensational, most lurid theories across their front pages, feeding the storm and leaving Natalia's loved ones to suffer under its weight. Still, the search for Natalia pushed on. It became a massive operation. Hundreds of police officers, firefighters, friends, family members, and volunteers combed through Uruguay's rugged coastline, the areas around the nightclub where she was last seen, and deep into the forests beyond. Service dogs sniffed through the terrain. Military and civilian aircraft soared overhead. Even the sewer systems were inspected. But Natalia seemed to have vanished into thin air. After those critical first 48 hours, the window where missing persons are most likely to be found, the hope of finding her alive began to dim. Law enforcement officials quietly began to prepare for the worst. Then, a grim discovery: on the Grande Plateau, a bone was found. For a brief, agonizing moment, everyone feared the worst. But tests confirmed it was not human. The search went cold again. Months passed, but Natalia's family refused to give up. They clung to hope that she was alive somewhere, being held against her will. In the year 2000, that hope was finally crushed. A hiker stumbled across a female body in the dense forest near Lake Yolo, miles from the nightclub where Natalia had last been seen. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, making identification difficult. However, the clothing matched what Natalia had been wearing that fateful night. Forensic experts, 5 in total, painstakingly worked through the evidence. Their conclusion was devastating: the body was indeed Natalia Martinez. The autopsy revealed faint signs of strangulation around her neck. No traces of drugs or alcohol were found in her system, and due to the body's deteriorated state, it was impossible to determine if she had been sexually assaulted. One haunting detail stood out: her wrists were tied with a thin nylon thread. Yet, whether she was bound before or after her death remained a mystery. As investigators tried to piece together what had happened, another dark twist unfolded. The same man who had found Natalia's belongings months earlier was found dead at the bottom of a cliff near his home. His identity was initially withheld from the public. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic suicide. But those who knew him, his friends, his family, his church community, insisted he would never take his own life. He loved life too much, they said. He loved them too much. An autopsy would confirm their worst fears: the man had suffered blunt force trauma to the head before the fall. He hadn't jumped. He had been thrown. 2 deaths. 2 mysteries. And now, an undeniable link. The tragedies continued. Overwhelmed by grief, plagued by rumors and unable to endure the unbearable weight of his daughter's death, Ever Martinez, Natalia's father, ended his own life with a gunshot to the head. His wife and daughter discovered his body. This time, the police concluded, without a doubt, that it had been suicide. For Natalia's family, the pain had become an endless abyss. For a long time, investigators seemed no closer to finding Natalia's killer. Leads dried up. Hopes faded. Until a tiny thread of information emerged, almost overlooked. It came from Natalia's own text messages, exchanged with a close friend just days before she vanished. In those texts, Natalia mentioned meeting someone new, a man she had gotten to know online. She was excited, but also a little wary. Digging deeper, police discovered that this man had been at the nightclub the night Natalia disappeared. Not alone, but with two other men, all slightly older than her. Witnesses had seen them sitting just a few tables away, something police had noted early in the investigation but, in the chaos, hadn't fully pursued. Now, the three men became prime suspects. When questioned, they stumbled over their alibis. Their stories didn't match. Where they had been, what they had done, the details twisted and changed under scrutiny. It was clear to the detectives, somewhere within those lies was the terrible truth about what happened to Natalia Martinez. But the full story? That part remains locked in the shadows, waiting, perhaps, for someone brave enough to finally uncover it. In the early stages of the investigation, police sat down with a witness, a young woman whose identity would remain a closely guarded secret for her own protection. She was the girlfriend of one of the men initially arrested. Nervously, she recounted what she knew, and what she said would turn the entire case on its head. Through her testimony, a new name surfaced, Rodrigo Verge, a 25-year-old man, part of the same group. She pointed a shaky finger toward him, suggesting he had a much deeper involvement in Natalia Martinez's death than anyone had suspected. Police would later confirm that Rodrigo had already raised red flags, having given conflicting and misleading statements during his initial interrogation. Authorities moved quickly. They monitored Rodrigo's phone calls, quietly recording conversations that further implicated him. DNA samples were also collected, but the advanced state of decomposition of Natalia's remains rendered them practically useless, another frustrating setback for investigators. Not willing to leave any stone unturned, police widened their net. They reached out to Rodrigo's circle, friends, acquaintances, even distant relatives, hoping someone might crack under pressure. On June 8, 2010, Rodrigo and his group of friends were summoned for questioning. That night, they had been at a bustling nightclub, supposedly partying into the early hours. Their story was airtight, or so they thought. They claimed innocence, swearing that after their night at the club, they had hired a sex worker to continue the festivities, but that none of them, especially Rodrigo, had any connection to Natalia. Rodrigo himself denied knowing her, denied even speaking to her. But the digital trail told a different story. Police uncovered a series of online messages, flirtatious, casual, and damning, between Rodrigo and Natalia. The two had not only spoken, they had planned to meet that very night at the club. Rodrigo's web of lies was beginning to unravel. Initially, despite the mounting evidence, the group stood firm. No one cracked. No one confessed. But the police were patient. They called Rodrigo back in the next day. The walls were closing in, and this time, Rodrigo couldn't hold it together. He confessed. According to Rodrigo, he had indeed met Natalia online, and after exchanging messages for some time, they agreed to meet in person. Their meeting at the nightclub was awkward, tense even. As dawn neared, Rodrigo suggested they move on to another nearby club, but he had darker intentions. He lured her away from the crowd, hoping to isolate her. When she rejected his advances, he initially seemed to accept the rebuff. But then, Natalia suffered a sudden asthma attack. Without her inhaler, she quickly began convulsing. Rodrigo panicked, paralyzed by fear. He claimed he had no idea how to help her. As she slipped away in the passenger seat of his car, he made a fateful decision. Rather than calling for help, Rodrigo decided to cover up what had happened. He was scared of the consequences. He drove toward the woods outside the city. There, under the gray morning light, he tied Natalia's lifeless body, dragged her deeper into the forest, and tried to cover her with branches and leaves. But that wasn't the whole truth. Shortly after, a beachgoer came forward, saying he had seen a young couple engaging in what he thought was rough intimacy near the woods. And when authorities examined Natalia's body, the evidence was undeniable. Signs of strangulation were present around her neck. Natalia hadn't just suffered an asthma attack. She had been assaulted and murdered. Rodrigo had left out the darkest part of the story. Eventually, police cleared his friends of any involvement. Rodrigo alone would face the consequences. He was officially charged with Natalia's murder and taken into custody. For a moment, it seemed the case had been cracked wide open. But then, a twist. As preliminary hearings began in mid-2010, Rodrigo recanted his confession. He claimed the police had coerced him into admitting guilt, insisting he was innocent. His defense team rallied around him, offering up an alternative narrative. They presented mobile phone records and a statement from Rodrigo's employer, suggesting he had been at work during the time of the murder, later attending a friend's wedding, acting, by all accounts, perfectly normal. However, the prosecution was ready. On September 2, 2010, Leonardo, a bookstore owner who had once been under suspicion himself, testified for the prosecution. He recalled an argument he had witnessed between a young man and another patron at the nightclub, and he identified that young man as Rodrigo. Natalia's friends backed this up too. Rodrigo had definitely been there that night. Further, forensic experts tore apart Rodrigo's asthma story. Natalia had indeed suffered from asthma, they explained, but such attacks don't kill instantly. It would have taken hours, and the clear marks of strangulation on her neck told a different, brutal story. Piece by piece, the case against Rodrigo was rebuilt. From late August to mid-September 2010, the prosecution meticulously reconstructed the events of that night. Ultimately, Rodrigo Verge was found guilty of Natalia Martinez's murder and sentenced to 9 years behind bars, a sentence many felt was far too lenient for the horror he had unleashed. In February 2011, Rodrigo's defense team appealed the conviction, claiming bias and a lack of direct evidence linking Rodrigo to the murder. But the court, as well as Natalia's grieving family, were unmoved. Natalia's loved ones, devastated, expressed their deep disappointment. 9 years was a mere blink of an eye compared to the life that had been stolen from their daughter, their sister, their friend. In the end, justice was served, but the scars left behind by Rodrigo's actions would never truly heal. This is the story of Sandra Miles, a woman whose life was filled with both hope and heartache, and whose fate would be cruelly sealed just as she was on the cusp of a new, joyful chapter. But before we get to Sandra's case, let's touch on another thread woven into this dark tapestry, the case of Natalia and Rodrigo Verge. It all began when Natalia's family, devastated and heartbroken, decided to take legal action. They filed a civil lawsuit against a man named Rodrigo Verge, accusing him of irreparably damaging their family and holding him directly responsible for the death of Natalia's father. Initially, they demanded a modest $15 in damages, almost symbolic, a token gesture for the justice they craved. However, as discussions wore on, emotions ran high, and the true weight of the pain they endured became clear. Eventually, both sides agreed to revise the damages to a much larger sum, $7,000. Yet, even as the financial settlement grew, Natalia's family sought something deeper, accountability. They petitioned the court for a longer prison sentence for Rodrigo, hoping it would reflect the gravity of what had been lost. But on October 27, 2014, their hopes were dashed. The court declined their request for a harsher sentence. Instead, Rodrigo, just 29 years old, was pardoned after serving only 4 years and 2 months behind bars, his early release attributed to good behavior while in custody. And so, yet again, a family was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life, wondering if true justice had ever really been served. Now, let's return to Sandra Miles, another life touched by tragedy. Sandra was born on May 26, 1949, in the small, cozy town of Harn, Kansas. Her early years were filled with simple joys, long walks to school with her sister, laughter around the dinner table, and dreams of building a warm, loving family of her own. After graduating high school, Sandra seemed to be living that dream. She married young and welcomed a beautiful baby boy, Chad. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. Her marriage crumbled quickly. Sandra realized too late that the man she married wasn't the partner she had hoped for. Still young and determined, Sandra gave love another chance. Sadly, heartbreak followed again. By 1976, now a single mother of one, Sandra secured a stable job at a factory that produced pumps and pistons for industrial machinery. It wasn't glamorous work, but it offered a steady paycheck, enough to support her small family. The job required her to move to Hutchinson, a bigger city, offering fresh opportunities and, eventually, a fresh start. It was here that Sandra met Jerry Miles. Sparks flew almost immediately. Their friendship quickly evolved into romance, and before long, they were married. To everyone around them, they were a picture of true love, a strong, united family. When Sandra gave birth to their daughter, Tracy, in September, it seemed like all of Sandra's hardships had finally paid off. For a while, their life was idyllic. Family trips to the lake, birthday parties, and holidays filled with laughter. Friends and neighbors marveled at their bond. But behind the smiles and family photos, a much darker story was unfolding. Jerry had a demon, a growing addiction to alcohol. At first, it was manageable, hidden behind happy family events. But over time, the cracks began to show. Jerry became unpredictable, volatile. The man Sandra had fallen in love with would disappear into a bottle, replaced by someone she barely recognized. 7 years into their marriage, Sandra reached her breaking point. She filed for divorce, making the painful decision to raise her children alone. Still, she never spoke ill of Jerry, she had loved the man he used to be. Working long hours at the factory to provide for her children, Sandra became a figure of resilience. She never complained. She never gave up. She was determined to build a good life for Chad and Tracy. Chad, now grown, moved out to start a life of his own, but young Tracy remained Sandra's pride and joy. Their bond grew deeper through the shared hardships, until the difficult teenage years arrived. By the spring of 1997, Sandra's relationship with 16-year-old Tracy had begun to fracture. Tracy had fallen for her first boyfriend and, like so many teenagers, began to rebel. The once tight bond between mother and daughter started to unravel. Desperate to bridge the gap, Sandra made a grand gesture. She bought Tracy a sleek Black Moon car, the very car Tracy had been dreaming about. Tracy was over the moon, showing off the car proudly at school, seemingly rekindling the spark between them. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like hope had returned to Sandra's life. And then, just when things appeared to be getting better, tragedy struck. On March 20th, Chad and his girlfriend, Mindy, visited Sandra with wonderful news: Mindy was pregnant. Sandra's heart swelled with happiness. She was about to become a grandmother, a new life, a new chapter, something pure and good after all the heartbreak. But fate can be cruel, so cruel. Sandra never got to hold her grandson in her arms. Before she could even begin preparing for the baby's arrival, her life would come to a shocking, devastating end. The darkness she had fought so hard to keep at bay all those years, finally caught up with her. Stay tuned for part 2, where we uncover the chilling events that led to Sandra's tragic death, and the shocking truth about those she trusted most. It was an ordinary morning when Pat Douglas Butler sat down for breakfast with her husband. The day was just beginning when the phone rang, an urgent call that would shatter the illusion of normalcy forever. On the other end of the line was Sandra's employer, sounding worried. Sandra hadn't shown up for work for 5 straight days, something completely out of character for her. They had tried to reach her multiple times, but their calls had gone unanswered. Pat's heart sank. Although she and her sister Sandra were close, they didn't speak every day, so Pat hadn't immediately noticed her silence. But now, with this troubling news, an awful feeling settled in her chest. She and her husband agreed without hesitation, they needed to check on Sandra. When they arrived at Sandra's modest home, the unease only grew. The house was locked up tight, curtains drawn, and there was an eerie stillness hanging in the air. Sandra lived there with her daughter, Tracy, a bright, lively girl who should have been home from school by now. But there was no sign of life. No sound. Nothing. Growing increasingly alarmed, Pat and her husband rushed to Tracy's school, hoping for some good news. Instead, they found only more worry. Tracy's teachers were puzzled, she hadn't been seen for days either. Ms. Noni, Tracy's class teacher, had also tried to reach the family, but her calls had gone unanswered, just like the employers. Panic mounting, Pat knew it was time to involve the authorities. She called the police to report both Sandra and Tracy missing. When officers arrived at the scene, Pat handed over a spare key she had kept for emergencies. No one was prepared for what they would find inside. As the officers stepped into the house, a terrible stench hit them, the unmistakable smell of death. Experienced as they were, they immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. The house was declared a potential crime scene, and backup was called in. When more officers arrived, they made a gruesome discovery. Inside Sandra's bedroom, lying on the bed and hidden beneath a blanket, was the decomposing body of a woman. Carefully pulling the blanket away, they found a chilling detail: a power cord from a household appliance was tightly wound around her neck. Sandra had been strangled. Her face and head bore multiple injuries, blunt force trauma, vicious and personal. Yet, because of the extent of the decomposition, it was impossible at first to know exactly how many times she had been struck, or with what. One thing was clear: her death was no accident. This was cold-blooded murder. Forensic experts confirmed her identity through dental records. It was indeed Sandra Miles, 48 years old, a hard-working, devoted mother who had spent her life trying to build a better future for her children. Now she was gone. And worse, her daughter Tracy was nowhere to be found. At first, detectives feared the worst, that Tracy, too, had been murdered. But a careful search of the house showed no evidence of her body. Hope sparked: maybe, just maybe, Tracy was still alive. The urgency of the investigation deepened. Tracy was immediately listed as a missing person, and a frantic search began. Detective Hutchinson took charge of the case. Every possible lead had to be pursued: neighbors, friends, co-workers, and of course, Sandra's complicated past relationships. Especially her ex-husbands. Sandra's family, her sister Pat, her son Chad, and her former spouses, were all notified. The news was devastating. Chad, in particular, was heartbroken. In a desperate plea to the community, he reached out through the local newspaper, begging anyone with information about his little sister's whereabouts to come forward. Tracy was all he had left. As investigators pieced together Sandra's final moments, a harrowing picture emerged. She had been savagely attacked, struck multiple times with a heavy, blunt object, enough to knock her to the ground. Then, when she was already incapacitated and helpless, her killers used a power cord to strangle the life out of her. The bruises and internal injuries painted a picture of prolonged violence and cruelty. Experts quickly ruled out a simple robbery. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacking. Apart from Tracy's favorite toy car, nothing appeared to have been taken. This wasn't a crime committed out of panic or greed, this was personal. Someone wanted Sandra dead. The brutality of the assault suggested something even darker: this was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was deliberate. It was rage. Detectives theorized that Sandra had likely known her killers, she had let them into her home voluntarily. And the level of force used indicated more than just fear of being caught, it pointed to a deep-seated grudge or a history of animosity. Suspicion soon turned toward Sandra's past, particularly her relationships with men. Her third husband, Jerry, quickly caught the attention of investigators. A man known to struggle with alcoholism, Jerry had a stormy history with Sandra after their divorce. Perhaps, fueled by resentment and intoxication, he had confronted her, and things had spiraled fatally out of control. But there were still unanswered questions. If Jerry, or someone else, had killed Sandra, what had happened to Tracy? Was she kidnapped? Or was she a witness on the run, terrified, hiding somewhere? The clock was ticking. Every hour that passed made it harder to believe Tracy would be found safe. Detectives knew one thing: they were hunting dangerous individuals capable of unspeakable violence. And they needed to find them before they could hurt Tracy, or anyone else, again. The search for answers had only just begun. At first, it seemed like the police were getting nowhere. One by one, they checked alibis, and one by one, suspects were crossed off the list. Anyone who could account for their whereabouts the night of the attack was swiftly removed from suspicion. Detectives worked tirelessly, interviewing everyone who had known Sandra, friends, family, co-workers, desperate to find a thread that might explain the violent scene they'd found and the chilling mystery of her daughter Tracy's disappearance. But leads were few, and frustration began to creep into the investigation. Sandra's sister, Pat, offered one of the first important pieces of information. She told detectives that she had last seen Sandra alive 5 days earlier. That day stood out sharply in her memory. A work call had pulled her away at the same time Tracy had left for her school. It quickly became a key date that detectives circled in red. Still, no breakthroughs. Friends and family offered little useful information. Most said the same thing: Sandra had no known enemies. She was protective of Tracy, sure, but who wouldn't be? So, the investigation shifted. If the people close to Sandra couldn't give answers, maybe her neighbors could. The neighborhood was the kind you dream about raising kids in: peaceful, friendly, a place where people knew each other's dogs and birthdays. But all that comfort shattered when news of the bloody scene at Sandra's house spread like wildfire. By morning, the street was clogged with concerned neighbors, reporters, and the grimly curious. Police had to block off the property just to keep order. Beneath the shock and confusion, a deeper fear took root. A killer was still out there, and maybe a kidnapper too. Tracy was still missing, and every passing hour made the situation feel more desperate. But in that frightened crowd, a witness finally stepped forward. A neighbor who lived directly across the street recalled something odd. About 5 days earlier, March 25th, he'd seen Tracy. She wasn't alone. 2 young men were with her. He watched them pile into one of the men's cars and drive off. He never saw her again. It was a strange detail. If Tracy had been taken by force, why would she willingly get into a car with 2 men? Something about it didn't sit right. The 2 young men were quickly identified as Mark and Jay, local kids from the area. Detectives wasted no time tracking them down. When officers approached Mark's home, they spotted a red car speeding away down the street. Inside was Mark. When he realized he was being followed, he stomped the gas and fled at breakneck speed. It was a foolish move, and it made him look guilty as hell. Officers radioed ahead, and before long, Mark's car was boxed in just a few kilometers from his house. Inside, they found Mark and his friend, both sweating bullets, full of excuses about being scared by the tragedy at Sandra's house. Seasoned detectives knew better than to buy that story outright. The boys were hauled down to the station. Under intense questioning, they stuck to their story. They hadn't seen Tracy since that day, and they had nothing to do with what had happened to Sandra. Their accounts matched almost too perfectly. Ultimately, the detectives had to let them go. No hard evidence, no charges. But their names were added to the list of people worth keeping a very close eye on. As police dug deeper, a more complicated picture of Tracy's life began to emerge. They learned she had recently ended a turbulent relationship with a young man named Jeremy Bell. And Sandra? She had fiercely disapproved of Jeremy from the start, convinced he was trouble. After all, Jeremy had a reputation, anger issues, brushes with the law, a hot temper that could boil over at the smallest slight. Sandra wasn't about to let someone like that pull her daughter down. And so, the fights began. Arguments between mother and daughter that left Tracy in tears, Sandra furious, and Jeremy increasingly isolated. Eventually, Sandra took it a step further. She filed for a restraining order against Jeremy, officially banning him from any contact with Tracy. Furious, Jeremy blamed Sandra for ruining his life, and he wasn't shy about telling anyone who would listen. At drunken parties, he ranted about her. How she destroyed everything. How he hated her. Detectives took these threats seriously. Very seriously. By the time of Sandra's murder, Jeremy was already on the police's radar. He was a loose cannon, angry, humiliated, and dangerous. Naturally, suspicion fell heavily on him. Had Jeremy finally snapped? Had he killed Sandra and taken Tracy as some twisted form of revenge? It seemed plausible, until investigators uncovered a critical detail. Jeremy was already in jail. Just a few days before Sandra's murder, Jeremy and a friend, William Lennon, had been arrested for burglary. He had an ironclad alibi, locked behind bars when Sandra died. If Jeremy wasn't the killer, then who was? And more urgently, where was Tracy? There had been no ransom note. No demands. No calls. Every hour that passed darkened the odds of finding her alive. Desperate for answers, detectives visited Jeremy in prison. He confirmed that his relationship with Tracy had ended, that the restraining order had destroyed whatever bond they had. Tracy, it seemed, had moved on, starting to date another boy, Paul Nelson. Jeremy's hatred hadn't faded, though. He spoke bitterly about Paul, accusing him of dragging Tracy into bad crowds, even suggesting that she might get caught up with drugs because of him. But when it came to Sandra, Jeremy claimed he had no lingering anger. He said, almost regretfully, that things had gotten better between him and Sandra once Tracy started dating Paul. Detectives weren't sure whether to believe him. They knew one thing for certain, though, somewhere out there, Tracy's fate was still a terrifying unknown. And time was running out. Tensions had been rising for weeks. Tracy's anger, once scattered in different directions, had now shifted squarely onto her mother, Sandra. Jeremy, a longtime friend, could sense the danger brewing. On March 25, just a day before tragedy would strike, Jeremy pulled Tracy aside and warned her about her new boyfriend, Paul Nelson. He had a bad feeling about Paul, calling him dangerous, unpredictable. By that time, the autopsy on Sandra was already underway. The medical examiner would soon reveal grim news. Sandra had died on March 26 from 4 vicious stab wounds and severe blunt force trauma to the head. If that weren't enough, strangulation was also used, almost as if someone wanted to make absolutely sure she wouldn't survive. It was a brutal, personal attack, and all signs pointed in one direction. The police needed to find Paul Nelson, fast. But Paul had vanished. His own parents reported him missing, saying they hadn't seen him since the day Sandra was murdered. Detectives suspected that Paul wasn't just missing, he was running. In trying to piece the puzzle together, investigators turned to someone who knew Paul better than most, a friend named Zwickle. When detectives spoke with Zwickle, he didn't hesitate to tell them what he knew. He explained how Sandra had been deeply worried about Tracy's relationship with Paul. Sandra had seen something dangerous in him. She believed he was pulling Tracy into a dark world, drugs, lies, crime. Despite Sandra's desperate warnings, Tracy continued to see Paul in secret, sneaking around behind her mother's back. When Sandra found out, the fallout was explosive. She confronted her daughter, telling her plainly, getting involved with a drug addict would ruin her life. But Tracy didn't want to hear it. She refused to see the truth. Sandra even went so far as to lay down an ultimatum: if Tracy insisted on staying with Paul, she would have to move out and live with him. Neither Tracy nor Paul was prepared for that kind of commitment. They had no home, no plan. Sandra suggested something even more heartbreaking, that Tracy consider ending her pregnancy. Tracy agreed, but it only deepened the rift between mother and daughter. The tension escalated to a boiling point. Sandra threatened to take Tracy's car keys if she didn't break things off with Paul. For two rebellious young lovers who already felt the world was against them, Sandra became more than just a disapproving parent, she became the enemy. Then came March 26. Zwickau told investigators that Paul came back to his place around 10 a.m., frantically packing his things. Paul said he and Tracy were leaving town, maybe forever. He said they had about $2,000 between them, enough to escape and start a new life somewhere far away. Zwickau assumed they were just running from a bad argument. He didn't yet know about the blood on Paul's hands. Paul mentioned that he had pawned Sandra's tape recorder for cash. But that was a lie. The recorder only fetched around $50, nowhere near the amount they had. Where had the rest of the money come from? As detectives dug deeper, they discovered something chilling. On the day after Sandra's murder, Tracy had gone to her mother's bank account and cashed a check, claiming her mother had given her the money to buy a new car. Bank employees recalled the young couple being eerily calm, no panic, no anxiety. It didn't add up. Were they fugitives? Or was Tracy a victim, forced to cooperate under duress? At first, police feared she might have been kidnapped. But Tracy's best friend, Candace Keno, shattered that theory. Candace revealed that Tracy had called her the day before Sandra's murder. During the call, Tracy admitted that her mother had taken away her car keys after a huge fight, and that she was planning to run away with Paul. It was no kidnapping. Tracy was a willing partner in whatever dark plan was unfolding. The trail led south. Paul and Tracy crossed the border into Mexico but soon found themselves lost, desperate, and out of options. Border Patrol agents later spotted them re-entering the U.S. near El Paso, Texas. The manhunt intensified. On April 8, Candace helped police one more time, providing Tracy's phone number. By tracking the call, authorities closed in on the pair. Later that day, Paul and Tracy were arrested on the outskirts of El Paso, tired, dirty, and out of luck. Paul didn't look like the monster many expected. He sat trembling during questioning, eyes locked on the floor, speaking in a broken voice. He confessed. On the night of March 25, Tracy and Paul had hatched a desperate plan. They would run away together, and to do that, Sandra had to be silenced. Paul described how he attacked Sandra, the stabbing, the blunt force, the final act of strangulation. And Tracy, far from being an unwilling hostage, had helped him escape and cover it up. Sandra had tried everything to protect her daughter. But in the end, her love wasn't enough to save her from the darkness that had already taken hold. At first, it seemed like a simple case of a missing person. A concerned family friend tried to reach Munchie, but no matter how many times they called, there was only silence on the other end. Days passed, and under growing pressure, Joe, Munchie's husband, finally reported her missing. But curiously, he didn't call 911. Instead, he contacted the non-emergency line, 311. It was a subtle move, one that didn't go unnoticed later. Munchie's parents, still in China, believed the police were doing everything they could to find their daughter. They had no idea that the clock had already been ticking, and not in their favor. On October 15, 2019, nearly a week after Munchie had vanished without a trace, Joe made an official report to the Columbia, Missouri Police Department. To detectives, he repeated what he'd already told the family friend: Munchie had seemed off the night before she disappeared. Stressed, distracted. Joe said she went to bed early, mentioning she had something important to handle the next morning. When he pressed her, asking 3 times who she was meeting, she refused to give a clear answer. Joe hinted darkly that he suspected she was hiding something, possibly an affair. Later, he told investigators he had found notes on Munchie's computer, fragments of emotional conversations she had been having with a man overseas, back in China. One text stood out, a heartbreaking confession where Munchie lamented that her husband no longer loved her. Joe spun a narrative. Maybe Munchie had run off to be with this man, leaving behind not just him, but more shockingly, their young daughter. He was careful to emphasize his love for their child, his hope that Munchie would return safely. But from the very beginning, detectives weren't buying it. Something about Joe's story just didn't sit right. Their suspicions deepened when they learned Joe hadn't even dialed 911 after realizing his wife was missing, a glaring red flag in cases like this. He seemed oddly detached. When questioned, Joe admitted that instead of organizing a desperate search, he had spent his time taking long, meandering drives around town, looking for new places to walk. Not looking for his missing wife. He even closed the door behind him when he left their apartment that morning, locking Munchie out, as if he didn't care whether she came back at all. And when police found her phone, her keys, her car, all untouched, it painted a chilling picture. Munchie hadn't planned to leave. Yet despite their instincts, detectives had no hard evidence. No blood, no weapons, no eyewitnesses. No body. There were also no signs that Munchie had fled to meet someone abroad. She hadn't booked any flights, her passport remained untouched. Everyone who knew her said the same thing, Munchie would never abandon her daughter. Never. Meanwhile, Joe remained cooperative. He even handed over his phone without resistance. But what investigators found next sent a chill down their spines. Hidden inside Joe's phone were over 10 hours of secretly recorded conversations between him and Munchie. In them, Joe belittled her, berated her, and coldly discussed how he wanted a divorce, how he planned to send her back to China, like unwanted cargo. It was damning, but it got worse. On Munchie's phone, police unearthed even more disturbing recordings, nearly 4.5 hours of footage where Joe's true nature came to light. He raged at her, called himself God, and threatened her parents, demanding they stay away from his home. It was terrifying. It was abusive. And it painted a far darker portrait of Joe than anyone had realized. The cracks in their marriage had started months earlier, when Munchie gave birth to their daughter. Following Chinese tradition, her parents flew in from China to help care for the baby during the critical, first 100 days, a sacred period of support and bonding. But Joe despised it. He resented having Munchie's parents in his home, speaking a language he didn't understand. Every conversation in Chinese, every family gesture, he took as a personal slight. The tension boiled over. Joe grew particularly hostile toward Munchie's mother. One incident started over something as small as the use of a cutting board while preparing dumplings for Joe's birthday. He exploded, cursing at her, demanding she leave his home immediately. Munchie, desperate for her mother's support during postpartum recovery, pleaded with Joe to reconsider. But Joe responded only with venom, accusing Munchie of incompetence simply because she was a woman. He manipulated, he controlled, and he isolated her. Things got even uglier. Joe threatened Munchie's mother, suggesting he could harm her if she didn't leave. The terrified woman, honoring her cultural values of peace and harmony, did not fight back. Eventually, she returned to China, heartbroken, confused, and deeply concerned for her daughter's safety. After that, Joe saw himself as victorious, back in charge of his household. And then, just a few months later, Munchie disappeared. Detectives now believed that Munchie had been trapped in an increasingly abusive relationship, cornered by cultural, legal, and emotional barriers. Just 5 months before she vanished, she had undergone another grueling immigration interview, her status in America still precarious. The stakes were terrifyingly high. She had nowhere to turn. Joe's story was crumbling, piece by piece. But without a body, without physical proof, detectives could only watch and wait, haunted by the possibility that whatever happened to Munchie had been carefully and ruthlessly planned. The question still remains. Where is Munchie? And will the truth ever come to light? It was 2 weeks after Munchie's mysterious disappearance when the Columbia Police Department finally opened a criminal investigation. That same day, 16 long, agonizing days since anyone had last seen her, the police arrested Joe Ledge. The charge? Suspicion of child abuse. In a quiet, emotionless confession, Joe admitted to physically abusing his 1-year-old daughter. He claimed it was discipline, just a young, overwhelmed single father trying to do his best, or so he said. But there was a darker story lurking beneath. Before she vanished, Ming-Chi had confided in her mother. She had seen bruises on her daughter's tiny body, ugly, unmistakable marks of violence. She suspected Joe was responsible. Her mother, deeply concerned, urged Ming-Chi to go to the police. But that chance was stolen. Ming-Chi would never get the opportunity. Joe's defense attorney immediately painted a different picture, a struggling young man being unfairly targeted. A mistake, they called it, not a crime. Joe was granted bail, released back into the world, while his mother stepped in to care for the little girl. Behind the scenes, detectives weren't buying it. They kept working, digging, probing, hunting for the truth. They were convinced Joe knew more about Ming-Chi's disappearance than he was letting on. On October 25, 2019, armed with a search warrant, they stormed Joe's apartment. Ming-Chi had been missing for over 2 weeks. Time was slipping away, and so was hope. Inside the apartment, they collected what little they could, Ming-Chi's small backpack, and some strange, unsettling notes Joe had written, as if coaching himself on what to say to reporters and police. Detectives, trusting their instincts, also seized a pair of dirty boots sitting by the door. No immediate smoking gun. No hidden body. No clear answers. But later that very day, Joe was arrested again. Fresh bruises were found on his daughter. The evidence of violence kept stacking up. Meanwhile, the desperate search for Ming-Chi had shifted. This was no longer a search for a missing person. It was a hunt for remains. Detectives methodically traced every movement of Joe's car, every ping of his phone. But every trail led to a dead end. Finally, the authorities made a bold decision. They charged Joe Ledge with murder, even though they had no body. Still, they pressed on. They had to find her. Phone records gave them a new clue. On the day Ming-Chi went missing, Joe had been gone for 30 minutes, a detail he failed to share with investigators. When detectives searched the area where he'd been, they found nothing. Weeks turned into months. Grief gave way to grim acceptance. Ming-Chi's mother, heartbroken but determined, traveled from overseas to join the search. She was convinced her daughter's body was close, just hidden, waiting to be found. Police scoured the fields, rivers, and woods. Vigils were held. Prayers were whispered. Still, nothing. Then, almost a year later, fate intervened. A tourist, wandering through the park where Joe had once proposed to Ming-Chi, noticed something glinting in the mud. A wallet. Nearby, a pair of shoes. And then, something far more chilling, a human skull. The police rushed to the scene. The remains were confirmed, it was Ming-Chi. Finally, her parents had answers. But closure remained elusive. So much time had passed that even forensic experts struggled to determine exactly how she had died. However, they found signs of unnatural trauma, for broken ribs, consistent with a powerful blow to the back. The pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Joe's cell phone data placed him at the park, the very place where Ming-Chi's remains were found, on the day she disappeared. It had been raining heavily that day, a detail that became critical. The muddy boots seized from Joe's apartment were sent to a botanical lab for analysis. At the Missouri Botanical Garden, technicians painstakingly removed juniper needles stuck to the boots. They climbed local juniper trees, collected samples, and compared the DNA. It matched. The debris on Joe's boots came directly from the place where Ming-Chi's body was discovered. On November 1, 2021, Joe Ledge finally stood trial for the murder of his wife. The prosecution laid out a devastating timeline, combining phone data, botanical evidence, and forensic analysis. They painted Joe as a violent, resentful man who, after months of rage and resentment, exploded into brutality. Joe's lawyer tried to salvage his defense. He spun a new story. Yes, Joe admitted, he buried his wife. But it wasn't murder, he insisted. It was a tragic accident. Joe claimed they argued that night. That Ming-Chi lunged at him, trying to take their daughter away. In the struggle, he shoved her. She struck a table, injured her ribs, and collapsed. She later went to bed, and by morning, she was dead. Joe, panicking, buried her in a shallow grave. But this story rang hollow. The prosecutor was ruthless. Joe was nearly twice Ming-Chi's size. The idea that he needed to defend himself seemed absurd. And the brutal rib injuries, for broken ribs, suggested a savage beating, not a simple shove. This wasn't an accident. It was premeditated rage. A buildup of anger that ended in tragedy. As the evidence mounted, the true story of Ming-Chi's final hours slowly emerged, a young woman trapped in an abusive relationship, silenced forever by the man she trusted. The courtroom fell silent as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Justice, at last, was within reach.